Heidi Grows Up by Charles Tritten. At 9 o'clock one evening, a very shy-appearing little girl stepped off the train at the big station in Lausanne. She stood for a moment, looking about her in bewilderment, a blanket roll and suitcase at her feet, her precious violin case hugged tightly under her arm. Her name was Heidi, and she'd come all the way from Dorfli, a little mountain village high up in the Alps. Her grandfather and the good doctor, who shared their winter quarters in the village, wished her to finish her education in a cultured school. But it was not without great sacrifice that she had been sent to the fashionable boarding school from which her friend, Clara, had just graduated. Clara had travelled with her, and now, while the big train stood snorting and whistling in the station, she leaned from the open window and smiled. Clara knew all about the school, and Heidi wished very much that her friend could continue the journey with her and stay on another term. Perhaps the older girl guessed this, for she was doing her best to be cheerful, speaking very loud to make her voice heard above the noise of the puffing engine. "It's going to be lots of fun, you'll see," she cried gaily. "Dancing lessons and everything. I wonder if you'll have your Lenoir, who is always so smart-looking. Oh, and Mademoiselle Raymond is very nice too. They're all nice in the school, though some may seem stern until you get to know them. Now, don't forget to remember me to Mademoiselle Larby." She caught sight of a tall and very English-looking woman who was hurrying towards them along the platform. "Ah, Miss Smith," she called as the teacher came up. "Here is my friend Heidi. She has just come all the way from Dorfli, just up from Meienfeld. Ah, the train is starting again. Goodbye, Heidi. Write to me soon. Goodbye. Goodbye." Miss Smith waved her gloved hand until the train was out of sight. But Heidi didn't move. She only hugged her violin tightly to her side, feeling quite deserted now that Clara, her last link with home, had disappeared. The Englishwoman turned to her. "So, you are the new student, Clara's friend. She often spoke of you and your grandfather and Peter in Dorfli. It must be a charming village." "It is home," said Heidi simply. "The school will be like home to you soon," the teacher assured her. "All our girls are very happy, and you will not find the lessons difficult." Miss Smith led the way out of the station, followed by a porter carrying Heidi's things. "We take a carriage here to drive up to the school. It is at Rosiatz, just above Lausanne, as Clara probably has told you." She helped Heidi up the high step into the carriage and sat down beside her. As they drove on, the green fields called to Heidi's mind the green slope of the Alm and her grandfather alone in his hut next to the pines. He would not be on the mountain long, she consoled herself. When the snows came, he would go down as usual and live with the doctor and his neighbours in Dorfli. For the once embittered old Alm uncle had become endeared to the villagers for his increasing thoughtfulness and care of the orphan Heidi. As a little child, she had been literally dumped on him by her Aunt Deta when a fine position had been offered to the woman, and she had found the daughter of her sister too much of a care. Heidi had been christened Adelheid after her mother, but nobody ever thought of calling her by that name, except the stern Fräulein Rottenmeier when Heidi had lived with Clara in Frankfurt. She hoped now that none of the teachers at Rosiatz would be like Fräulein Rottenmeier. Certainly, Miss Smith was different, determined as she was to be pleasant and talkative. Heidi sat in her corner of the carriage, only half listening as the teacher rattled on. She switched from one subject to another with alarming rapidity. Her ancestors. It seemed that one of them had come from Milan. Mademoiselle, the headmistress, who was kind but firm. Clara, Mops, a perfect jumble of kindly chatter which left poor Heidi quite bewildered. "Mops is so affectionate. He has never bitten anyone yet," she finished unexpectedly, just as Heidi was thinking that Mops seemed a very odd name for a professor. "Oh, he's a cat," she said, light breaking over her face. "Oh, I'm glad there's a cat. We had kittens at Clara's." At last they reached Hawthorne, as the school was called, and Heidi, still dazed by her long journey, Miss Smith's chatter, and the strangeness of everything around her, found herself in a large reception-room, where she was greeted by a very dignified lady of some 50-odd years. The woman spoke kindly, in spite of her stern appearance. "Welcome to Hawthorne, Heidi. We are very glad to have you with us. I hope that you had a pleasant journey and that you are going to give as much satisfaction as your friend Clara. Are you hungry? Louise the cook has prepared some cold meat and fruit for you. Ah, what have you there under your arm? Oh, a violin. Your grandfather wrote to me that you'd learn to play. It seemed to please him very much. Here you will be placed in good hands for your violin lessons. She turned to the English teacher. Miss Smith, will you please show Heidi to her room and see that she has everything that is necessary? Good night, Heidi. Sleep well. The rising bell rings at 7 in the morning. Good night, said Heidi timidly. You should say, good evening, mademoiselle. The headmistress corrected her at once. Heidi looked from one strange face to another. Miss for the English teacher, mademoiselle for the headmistress, and at home she'd always been taught to call the schoolmistress Fraulein. How would she ever get them straight? Confused and tired, she followed Miss Smith down a long hall. The room which she was to share with a young English girl, Eileen, was on the 2nd floor. All the other rooms were closed and quiet. Everyone seemed to be asleep. Walk softly so as not to awaken the girls, said Miss Smith. You can arrange your things tomorrow. Now, shall we go to the dining room? Thank you. I'm not hungry, said Heidi. You will take your meat and fruit as the headmistress has directed, Miss Smith said firmly. Without waiting for Heidi to reply, she turned and led the way to the dining room. When Heidi had eaten what she could, they continued on up the stairs. Finally, they reached the room. Heidi looked around in the dim light and saw 2 wooden beds, 2 wash bowls, 2 closets, 1 table and 2 chairs, all glistening white. The room seemed very comfortable. But the moment Miss Smith closed the door, a wave of homesickness swept over Heidi. In spite of all her courage, tears filled her eyes. She went to the window and very gently opened the shutters. Everything was calm, so calm it almost seemed like her own countryside. A full moon rode in the sky and traced a golden path across the water of the lake. Heidi blinked back her tears. Already she loved the lake and felt cheered because it was there. The door opened without a sound, and 6 curious heads peeked in. Come in. I'm Heidi, she said in a whisper. Who are you? The 6 stole in on tiptoe, and 1 dark girl stepped forward to introduce the others. This is Eva Muller from Hamburg, she said, presenting the blonde German miss. She is the tallest of us all, and so we all respect her. She hauled forward the next 2. Edith and Molly, 2 close friends who came together from England. Behind them is Jeanne-Marie, a Hungarian girl. We've shortened her name to Jamie to fit her little person. She turned to the last of the group. And here is Mademoiselle Anne de Fauconnet. One of her famous ancestors, Gaeton, fought in the Battle of Issus with Saint Louis in 6000 BC. Oh, Lisa, cried the girl, my ancestor was not named Gaeton. He never fought with Saint Louis, and it wasn't in the year 6000 BC. How can you say such things? She was not a bit angry, for she had soon discovered that her roommate's constant teasing was all in good fun. And now for me, continued Lisa. I am Lisa Brunet, Swiss, vaguely related to Mademoiselle the directress, who doesn't love me any better for it. When Eileen comes, we shall be complete. Now, tell us about yourself. In a few words, Heidi told them about her life with the grandfather, high in the Alps, and the time she had spent with Clara in Frankfurt. At Dorfli, the schoolmistress was enthusiastic about my music, but when she left, the new schoolmaster didn't want to be bothered teaching the violin. He was stern and hard. All he thought of was teaching the children what was necessary and keeping them in order. Grandfather could see I was not happy in such a school, so he and my godfather, the doctor, decided to send me to Lausanne so that I might study with a good professor. I didn't want to go at first, but they thought it best. Now, back to bed, said Lisa. We'll see you tomorrow. One after the other, they slipped out. Jamie, the last, smiled so sweetly at Heidi that the newcomer forgot she was homesick and felt warm and happy again. Undressing quickly, she knelt beside her bed to say her prayers. Then she lay down on her bed to sleep. The sun, shining through the lattice windows, awakened Heidi before the rising bell. A busy day followed, filled with both pleasant and unpleasant happenings. Heidi met the French teacher, Mademoiselle Raymond, who was very long and thin and near-sighted. She wore a high collar and a high knot of hair on the top of her head, and there was a row of buttons that paraded down her back like so many small beetles. She stooped down to look at Heidi and murmured, "I am very strict, especially about dictation. Your friend Clara learned well, very well indeed." Heidi began to be afraid that she couldn't live up to Clara, of whom everybody in the school had such a good opinion. She felt even more convinced of this when she talked to Fräulein Felt. "Good morning, Heidi. I hope we shall be a happy family, and that you are going to be as gay and lovable as your friend. Clara had such a delightful disposition." She said this to impress Heidi with the importance of good behaviour, but privately Fräulein Felt had a very real sympathy for this simple 14-year-old country girl with her 2 long braids and her plain cotton dress. How would her classmates receive her? All of them were girls of good families and more or less well-to-do. The first morning Heidi made 52 errors in the dictation, about which Mademoiselle Raymond was so very strict. She did not understand one of Fräulein's orders in gym class, and she had made a spot on the spotless tablecloth at luncheon. Mademoiselle Larby, the headmistress, gave her a very severe look. "We are not living in a village," she said. "You must learn to eat properly." "Excuse me, mademoiselle," said Heidi. "It was an accident." "Do not answer back when I correct you. It's impertinent," said the headmistress. Heidi, who had not meant to be rude, sat silent and confused. Mademoiselle Larby resumed, "This afternoon you will take a walk with Miss Smith. At 4:30, when Eileen has arrived, I shall meet you in the study room and read aloud the rules of the school. Be especially kind to Eileen, girls. Her father has just died at Buenos Aires, where he was consul general, and her mother is ill." After the walk, Heidi went to her room and found Eileen, the new pupil, in a flurry of dresses, hats, slippers, books, gloves, and suitcases. "How do you do, Eileen? I am Heidi, your roommate." "How do you do?" Eileen replied stiffly, not bothering to raise her head. "May I help you with your things?" Heidi offered, remembering that the headmistress had asked the girls to be especially kind. "No, thank you. I'd much rather have this room to myself. Couldn't you ask to be changed?" Eileen demanded. "I'm afraid not," Heidi told her. "The other girls have been here longer than I. They already have roommates." "How annoying!" And Eileen turned her back unsociably as she continued unpacking her suitcases. On the balcony, Heidi found Jamie, Lisa, Anne, and Ava. "Eileen is here," she announced. "Yes? What is she like?" asked Lisa. "Tall, thin, with very black hair and green eyes," said Heidi. "Is she nice?" asked Jamie. "Go in and see for yourselves, and then tell me what you think of her," Heidi responded. The 4 girls disappeared through the long French doors leading into the room. "Hello, Eileen," they said. "Oh, hello. Why am I in the same room with that little peasant girl?" the new girls stormed. "But that's Heidi," protested Lisa. "Who is Heidi?" demanded Eileen. "Clara's friend," spoke up Ava. "The granddaughter of the Alm uncle up in the mountains," added Anne. "She plays the violin beautifully," said Jamie. "Then she is an artist. A peasant and an artist. How dreadful! Why couldn't I have a room with you?" asked Eileen, turning toward Anne, whose cultured French background made her quite distinguished looking. "Impossible. Since I came 3 days ago, I've been afflicted with the companionship of Lisa here. We argue all the day long, but I wouldn't leave her for the world." "What a pity. And you?" persisted Eileen, turning to Ava. "Me?" asked Ava, somewhat taken aback. "Oh, I'm very happy rooming with Jamie. I'm big and she's little, so we balance each other perfectly. Anyway, Heidi is very nice, and we all like her." "She doesn't please me," said Eileen majestically. "That's just too bad," concluded Lisa. But she left the room with a merry twinkle in her eyes. Heidi had been attacked, and they had all had an opportunity to defend her. On one side of the classroom, where the new students gathered to hear the solemn reading of the rules, a large door opened on a beautifully kept garden. While they were waiting for Mademoiselle Larby to come, Heidi slipped out to look at the little clusters of primroses in the short grass. "Heidi, here she comes," warned one of the girls. Heidi just had time to slip back into her place when Mademoiselle Larby marched in. She began to read in a solemn voice. "Rules of Hawthorne School. 1. Politeness is the rule at all times. 2. At 9:30, all lights are to be out. 3. You are forbidden to play the piano when the windows are open. 4. You are not permitted to hang pictures or photographs on the wall." And so on and on, for 2 long pages. Then there were enumerations of penalties. No promenade, fines of 10 centimes to 1 franc, room confinement, parents notified, dismissal. All the students were much impressed and looked at one another in silence after the headmistress had left the room. But Lisa, more mischievous than the rest, saved the situation by remarking in the pedantic manner of Mademoiselle Larby, "Above all, it is forbidden to take those rules too seriously." The girls were all laughing when Mademoiselle Raymond came into the room. She hushed them with a lifted finger. "Go to work now," she said reproachfully. "You, Lisa, to the piano. Heidi, Monsieur Rochard is here to give you your first violin lesson. Eileen, you may go and tidy your room. Anne and Ava will have a lesson in English, and the rest of you will study with me." Monsieur Rochard took a fatherly interest in Heidi and asked her many questions about her life at Dorfli. To these she responded with frankness and simplicity, as was her custom. Then he, in turn, told her about the mountains which he knew and loved. He passed his vacation in the Alps every year, acting as guide for the students of the school when they went climbing. "How long have you been playing the violin?" he asked Heidi. "For 2 years," she replied. "And who first gave you the idea of playing?" he continued, feeling a growing interest in his new pupil. "First, the murmur of the wind in the pines high up on the mountain, and then Clara gave me a violin," said Heidi. "Good. Now let us see what you can do." Heidi wanted so much to please the new teacher that her fingers were all thumbs and she played very badly. "My child," he said, "you have a long way to go before you become an accomplished musician." "The violin didn't sound like that when I played it up on the elms," said Heidi, looking at the instrument in perplexity. "The violin is all right," her music teacher told her. "It is only the girl who feels the strangeness of her surroundings." "When I look at the lake," said Heidi, "I do not feel strange any more." "Then play by the window, child." "Indeed I will," said Heidi, rushing to the open shutters. "Now I will play for the grandfather and the good doctor and Brigitte and Peter up in the mountains." "You will play well, Heidi," said the music teacher, "but you will always play best for those who most need your music." Heidi soon settled down at Hawthorne, and the weeks passed quickly and quite pleasantly. In no time at all, it was the end of the first term. Some of the students were leaving for the vacation. Lisa was going to the country to spend a month with her parents. Anne was going home to Brittany. Ava was leaving with friends with whom she was going to pass her vacation in the mountains. But Eileen, Heidi, Jamie and the 2 English girls were staying at school. With Ava going, Heidi would have liked to have shared her room with Jamie, who had become her best friend, but she would not ask permission to change for fear of hurting Eileen. One day, near the beginning of vacation, she received a little package from Dorfli, beautifully wrapped and tied with string. The girls were curious and tried to guess what it was. "It's chocolate." "No, it's a round package." "Perhaps it's a bunch of flowers. They'll be quite withered." "All wrong. I'm sure it's a cake." "Hurry, Heidi," they all begged. "Open it and see who's right." Heidi cut the string and opened the package. To the astonishment of all the other girls, there lay a little goat cheese, round and white. "Cream cheese!" they exclaimed, wrinkling their noses. "It smells bad," one of the English girls said. "Poor Heidi! Your grandfather must have thought you were starving." "It's a good joke," they all agreed, beginning to giggle. Heidi alone did not laugh. For a moment she wished she might throw the unfortunate cheese out of the window because they were all making fun of her. Then she felt instantly ashamed of herself. In her mind she saw the little hut on the elm and her grandfather working over the copper kettle. She remembered how willingly she had climbed onto the little chair he had made for her when she heard the call to supper. And usually there was nothing but coarse bread and cheese and goat's milk to wash it down. How hungrily she and Peter had eaten cheeses like this when they'd climbed together to tend his flock up on the mountain. The grandfather's 2 goats, Schweinli and Bearli, had given of their best milk to make it, and the grandfather himself had stirred it to a snowy consistency with his great wooden spoon. Now Heidi confessed to a yearning for the familiar taste of cheese. "You are welcome to it," her schoolmates teased her. Laughing and joking, they left the room holding their noses. "Phew, what a smell! Quick, some air! Throw open a window and let the wind do its worst." "I don't want to stay in that room. She'll probably keep her cheese for a souvenir, and I can't stand that odour," cried Eileen. Everybody stopped laughing. Edith, who was so polite, elegant and refined that everyone copied her, looked at Eileen in surprise. "But Eileen, you're not serious, I hope. We were only joking." "Oh, you can talk. Heidi isn't in your room," said Eileen. "If I weren't sharing a room with Molly, whom I've known for so long, I would love to room with Heidi," said Edith warmly. "Well, not I," snapped Eileen. "I've had enough of her. I'm going to ask Mademoiselle Larby to change my room." "You wouldn't." "I certainly would. Just see." The study bell rang and cut short the commotion. In spite of it being vacation time, the students worked every day between 5 and 6:30. They all marched to their classes, looking as if something unpleasant had happened. Heidi looked especially sad when she entered the music room, where Monsieur Rochard was waiting for her. "What's the matter, Heidi?" he asked with deep concern. "Have you received bad news from Dorfli?" "Thank you, no," replied Heidi. "Grandfather and the doctor are well, and Peter and his mother are very happy in the doctor's house." "Then it must be here that something is wrong," persisted her teacher. "No, everything is all right," said Heidi. Monsieur Rochard questioned her no more, but he resolved to find out what had happened. He was very fond of Heidi, and he couldn't bear to see her looking sad without knowing the reason. After class, he went into the library as usual to wait until it was time for dinner. There he found a group of teachers, talking excitedly and wagging their heads at one another. Now he was sure that something had happened. But what? "It's unthinkable," the headmistress was saying in a shocked tone. "One would suppose that my students were starving, that I did not give them enough to eat. What will everyone think of my school? I don't know what to do." She wrung her hands quite tragically. Something was displayed on the library table. They were all scrutinizing it, but Monsieur Rochard from his corner failed to see what it was. "The question, it seems to me," remarked Mademoiselle Raymond, "is not so much what to do with this outrage, as what to do with Eileen. She does not wish to room with Heidi any more." "I can well understand that," the headmistress sighed. "A child so delicate, so sensitive. What is your opinion of all this, Miss Smith? What room can we give Heidi? Of course it's perfectly clear that no one will want to stay with a little peasant who harbours goat cheese in her room." Monsieur Rochard had listened thus far without comprehending. Now he understood. His mouth twitched a little, but still he said nothing. "It is impossible to sleep in the same room with Heidi," the English teacher gave out as her opinion, "if she keeps that cheese. It would not be healthy." The music teacher had come a little closer, his mouth still twitching under his heavy moustache. "Have Jamie, Edith and Molly come in, and we will try to arrange something," said Mademoiselle Larby after a pause. Fräulein hurried to call them. They were all three in the English girls' room having a heated discussion. "Mademoiselle," began the headmistress when Fräulein had brought the girls to the library, "you know what has happened. Your schoolmate, Eileen, has refused to room with Heidi. Would one of you mind rooming with Eileen?" For a moment there was complete silence. Then Edith raised her eyes and said, "Mademoiselle, we would all three like to share a room with Heidi." Then Jamie spoke up. "Molly and Edith are friends. While Ava is away on vacation, I am alone. Could Heidi please move in with me?" "We will decide that later," said the headmistress, a little disconcerted. "You may go now." She turned to Monsieur Rochard, who had been enjoying the little scene immensely. "What am I going to tell Eileen? She will be heartbroken, poor child." "Possibly, but it will do her good," replied the music teacher. "Does nobody think of Heidi's heart?" The teachers looked at one another, confused, and Monsieur Rochard left the library, chuckling to himself. When he met Heidi at dinner, Monsieur Rochard called her aside and spoke to her gently. "I hear you have received a speciality from Dorfley, a beautiful goat cheese. May we not taste it? I'm sure your chums have never eaten it, and as for me, it is not often I have such a treat." Heidi blushed and looked at the girls who were sitting at her table. Everywhere she saw smiles of encouragement, and, once more, Edith spoke for the others. "Do please let us try it, Heidi," she begged. Everyone, except Eileen, who wouldn't touch it, ate a piece of the speciality from Dorfley. Some thought it delicious, while others did their best to pretend to like it. Heidi knew when they were merely being polite by the tone of their voices, and she smiled to see Molly's face as she courageously finished her piece. After dinner, Mademoiselle Larby joined the girls in the dining room. "Eileen," she said, "we have decided to let you have a room alone. Not one of the girls in your class wished to share it with you." Eileen said nothing. The headmistress continued. "They all expressed their willingness, however, to room with Heidi. It seems to me that this is something which you will understand better if you think it over by yourself. I will talk with you later on the subject in my office. You may come at 8:30. As for you, Heidi, you may move into Jamie's room and take what's left of your little goat cheese with you." "Oh, thank you, mademoiselle!" Heidi exclaimed gratefully. Her eyes were like lakes shining with happy tears. The following morning, in the village of Dorfley, the doctor met Peter and asked for news of the Alm uncle up on the mountain. "He is very sad," sighed Peter. "Sad? Why?" asked the doctor, surprised. "Because he's lonely," said Peter, simply. "But that is just what he wanted," exploded the doctor. "Don't you think I did everything I could to keep him from going up to that hut alone?" "He is sad because he misses Heidi," said Peter. "How do you know that?" demanded the doctor. Peter thought a moment before he answered. "The uncle never laughs. He just sits on his bench, and when I go by with the goats, he says, 'Heidi would like to go up on the mountain with you today.' Sometimes he says, almost to himself, 'It seems it is best she should not come, but I'm not sure.'" "Thank you, Peter," said the doctor. "I shall go and see him myself." Next morning, about 10 o'clock, when the doctor reached the hut, the bench was empty. Perhaps the Alm uncle was in the back mending some of his tools, but he was not there either. Feeling anxious, the doctor went into the kitchen, and what he saw made him stop short in the doorway. The old man was seated before the table, his head bowed on his folded arms. He seemed to be sleeping. "Good morning, uncle. You didn't hear me come in," said the doctor. "I hope I haven't disturbed you." "Oh, my friend, it's you," cried the Alm uncle, straightening himself. "You're good to come all the way up here. Any news of our little girl this week? I have her last letter right here." He pulled the letter from his pocket and laid it on the table. "It seems she loves the sewing class and is looking forward to teaching the young girls of Dorfley how to sew." They talked for hours about Heidi's proposed sewing class, about her music, and about the friends she'd made in the school. The grandfather's eyes were bright as they talked, but when the doctor rose to go, he again looked dejected. "I would stay longer," his friend told him, "but it is already 4 o'clock, and I promised to see old Sir Pelly this afternoon. He's nearing the end." "Huh. We're the same age, Sir Pelly and I," mused the Alm uncle. "We were both just 20 years old when we first met down in the valley." It seemed as though he had more to say, but he stopped short, lost in thought. Perhaps he was thinking of his wasted youth, his parents long gone, or of the many years he had spent as a hermit alone on the mountain before Heidi came to him. After a long silence, he began again in a low voice. "Yes, we are the same age, And you say he is ready to die." And now the doctor understood all that was passing through the old man's mind. After he had made his call on old Sapelli, the doctor hurried home to his desk and wrote the following letter. "Chère Mademoiselle, I had intended leaving my goddaughter Heidi at school for the vacation so that she might continue her music lessons. I find now that I must change my plans. Her grandfather misses her very much. He is well on in years, and I do not feel that I have the right to deprive him of his beloved grandchild any longer. Therefore I would like to have you make the necessary arrangements for Heidi to come to Dorfli for the month of August. I am too busy to fetch her myself, and I would be grateful if you will have someone come with her as far as Meinfeld, if not all the way to Dorfli. I know that Heidi is very fond of her young friend Jamie, and it would give us pleasure to have her as our guest for several weeks. You know me well enough to recommend me to her parents. I would appreciate your cooperation in sending the girls to us as soon as possible. With kind regards, very sincerely yours, Dr. Reboux." The letter reached the school on Saturday evening by the 5 o'clock mail. Heidi was waiting at the gate with Jamie when the postman came. "Is there anything for me?" the girl asked eagerly. Ever since the others had left for vacation, the mailman had been more friendly. Perhaps he felt a little sorry for those who had to remain at school. So, against the strict orders of Mademoiselle Larby, he showed the girls the bunch of letters directed to the school. "A letter from my godfather, the doctor, and it's addressed to the headmistress. That's strange, and nothing for me," exclaimed Heidi, recognizing the well-known handwriting. "A postcard from Mamma," said Jamie. "She's at the seaside with some friends, her friends, not mine." After a little silence, Jamie went on, "It's nice of her to send me a picture of the hotel, no doubt the nicest one there. She has plans for the autumn and cannot come to see me, but it doesn't matter. I'm used to it by now." But she spoke in a very small, halting voice that could not conceal her hurt feelings. Heidi, who was thinking about the other letter, and only half listening to Jamie, raised her head, suddenly aware of her friend's tone. Jamie never spoke of her family, and Heidi knew only that her father was in the diplomatic service. "What's the matter, Jamie?" she asked. "If your mother can't come, it must be because she has something very important to attend to. You'll most likely see her at Christmas time." "No," replied Jamie. "Then she'll have another excuse not to come, and I shall leave for England next year without a visit home, and without having seen a single one of my family, neither my father nor my little sister." Heidi knew how it felt to be unloved, because of the few lonely years she had spent with Aunt Data before she was finally brought to the grandfather. It meant having no one to notice whether or not you ate, no one to see if your eyes were red or if you didn't look well, no one to hear you coughing and be worried about you, no one to talk lovingly to you, to come to your room and open the shutters and lean over your bed and kiss you good night, to understand that in spite of your 14 years, you are still a little girl who needs love and protection. Poor Jamie. Perhaps there was no one in the whole world who was particularly interested in her, and maybe that was the reason why she was so often sad. Heidi put her arm affectionately round her friend's neck and said warmly, "Jamie, I'm staying in school for the vacation too. Together we can have a wonderful time. We can take trips to the mountains with Monsieur Rochard. First we'll go to the rocks of Nye and spend the night at the chalet of Sourdoz, so as to be there early in the morning to see the sunrise. You don't know how beautiful it is when the mountains are all aglow. And we'll find all kinds of wild flowers. Then we'll cross the lake in a little steamboat and climb up to the Ochre's Tooth. Monsieur Rochard might even take us to the hospice of Saint Bernard, and we can see the mementos of Napoleon's march across the mountains with his army. Monks live away up there all the year round, with those big dogs that go out in the deep snow to rescue lost travellers. Then there are lots of other things to see. The salt pits at Bex, the fairy grotto of Saint Maurice. You just see if we don't have a beautiful summer." Heidi was so enthusiastic about it all that Jamie caught her spirit and was quite cheered. "What is the fairy grotto?" she asked. "It's like a large corridor in the mountain leading to an underground lake. Monsieur Rochard told me about it. The entrance is very small and narrow. You reach it by climbing a steep hill above the Rhone River, and there is a little house perched way up there for the nuns, and there is a guide to take you through. They give you a lamp to light your way along the dark passage. And then, can you see the fairies? Asked Jamie. You can't see them, but you can hear them, Heidi told her mysteriously. They have a room deep in the mountain, and no one knows where it leads. If you put your ear against the wall, you can hear the sound of a drum. They say it's a warning to those who are too curious and want to enter their retreat. Monsieur Rochard heard it quite distinctly. Do you believe in fairies, Heidi? Asked Jamie, who had quite recovered her spirits by this time. Not exactly, but Grandfather knows a great many legends and folk tales, and I love to hear them. Oh, I love legends too, echoed Jamie. Maybe sometime you can come to Dorfley to visit me, and then you can hear the legends too. You aren't going to live in Dorfley all your life, are you? Asked Jamie, looking at her in surprise. Why not? Heidi wanted to know. You'd get lonely after a while and feel shut in from the rest of the world, like a monk or a nun. Shut in on those mountains? Never, cried Heidi. There's nothing in all the world that makes me so happy as going up on the mountains with Peter while he tends his goats. You may think me odd, Jamie, but when you've found something like that, you don't lose it. You keep it for the rest of your life. But just going up to the mountains with the goats, Jamie protested. It isn't, well, useful. What will you do with your education? I'll give it away, Heidi replied lightly. I'll teach all the children in Dorfley everything I've learned here in Lausanne. How to sew and cook and knit, perhaps even how to paint pictures and play the violin. Oh, you'll see. I shall not be idle. I may even send for you to come and help me. I'd love to come, anyway for a while, said Jamie. But I don't believe Papa would want me to stay there. His ideas are all about social life and meeting the right people. When I've learned to speak French and English well, he expects me to help him at the embassy. And then you will come to visit me at Budapest, Vienna or Berlin, maybe even in Paris or London. Perhaps, said Heidi doubtfully. Monsieur Rochard said I must go to Paris if I mean to continue my studies with the violin, but I'm not at all sure I want to go to Paris when those I love best are in Dorfley. While Heidi and Jamie were still talking at the gate, Mademoiselle Raymond appeared at the other end of the path and called to Heidi, waving her hands to beckon her, but without raising her voice. She never raised her voice, no matter what happened. Heidi? Heidi, where are you? Ah, there you are. She came over to the gate and asked, with great concern, Heidi, is your village very high? Does one go up on foot or on mules? How many hours does it take to travel up from Meienfeld? I think it would take 2 or 3 hours on foot, Heidi told her. On foot? Cried Mademoiselle. There must be an easier way. Yes, said Heidi, you can take the mail cart at Meienfeld. There is a mail cart. Well, why didn't you say so at once? Thank heaven for that. Excuse me, Mademoiselle, but may I know why you asked me all those questions? Do you mean to spend your vacation at Dorfley? Asked Jamie. Heaven forbid! But it may be necessary for me to travel to Dorfley, and I am not as young as you are. Why may you be obliged to travel to Dorfley? Asked Heidi. Has anything happened to my grandfather? Is anybody ill? Do not worry, my child. Your grandfather and your godfather and your friends in Dorfley, so far as I know, are well. I did not mean to alarm you, the teacher added. But what has happened? Persisted Heidi. Mademoiselle Larby will tell you when she considers it time for you to know. And with that, she left them, mystified and puzzled. Jamie, what do you make of it? Demanded Heidi. Nothing good, said Jamie. It seems to me that they have sent for you to go home. That is nothing good for me, anyway. It looks as if our plans are spoiled, and I shall have to stay here all alone all summer. Do you really think that is what my godfather wrote to the headmistress about? Asked Heidi. I'm sure. Mademoiselle Raymond is probably going to have to take you there, and that's why she's so worried. I hope you have a nice vacation, said Jamie, wistfully. Heidi was silent. She longed to see her grandfather and the doctor. She knew Peter had missed her and would be waiting for her to go again with him and his mountains up on the mountainside. But she didn't want to leave Jamie. Poor Jamie, with no one except herself to care whether she had a nice time or not. Heidi took her hand, and together they walked back to the school building. Heidi found, when she went for her practice hour on the violin, that the music had a sad, sweet tone. It was as though the mountains and the lake were both calling her. "You are playing very well," Monsieur Rochard told her. But Heidi felt she was not playing at all. It was only the violin. She was still under the spell of her own music that evening, when Mademoiselle Larby came to her and said, "My child, I have a message for you from your godfather. Will you come with me to my office?" Jamie looked at her roommate, as much as to say, "At last you're going to find out what was in that letter." Heidi was quiet and subdued as she followed the headmistress down the long hall to her office. 10 minutes later she rushed out and quickly closed the door. Then she broke into a run. She tore down the hall and up the stairs like a mountain goat going over the rocks, and bursting into the room she cried, "Jamie, Jamie, I'm going to Dorfley for the month of August, and you too. The doctor asked Mademoiselle Larby, and she telegraphed your father, and he has given his permission. Isn't it wonderful? Where's my suitcase? What do I need to take? Nothing much anyway, because I've more suitable clothes than these at home." Jamie leaned against the wall as if stricken dumb. For a long moment she could neither move nor speak. Heidi, laughing happily, grabbed her by the shoulders. "You're coming with me, don't you understand? We're leaving tomorrow morning. Mademoiselle Raymond will take us all the way to Dorfley, where the doctor will meet us. We'll probably spend the night at his house, and then the day after tomorrow morning we will go up to the grandfather on the mountain with Peter and the goats. But why don't you say something? Aren't you glad?" "I'm too happy to speak," said Jamie. Before long, Jamie found her voice again, and nothing could stop her chatter. During the whole evening, she and Heidi tried to out-talk one another while they packed their bags. If Jamie had listened to Heidi, she would have taken only a few underclothes and a linen dress. It seemed that the people of Dorfley didn't wear shoes or hats or coats. Fortunately, Mademoiselle Raymond superintended the packing. At 10:30 the bags were taken down to the hall, and there was relative silence in the bedroom, though from time to time a murmur still came from one or other of the beds. "Did you think of your alpenstock?" Or, "Where did you put my bedroom slippers?" Or, "Will I find postcards at Dorfley to send to Mamma and Papa?" At midnight everything was calm and still, except for the soft breathing of the two girls. It was early on a pleasant summer's evening that the two girls left the station at Meienfeld and took the narrow road which started as a gentle slope and became steeper and steeper as it approached Dorfley. Mademoiselle Raymond, after all, was not undertaking the long climb. Having been assured that the girl would reach the village before dark and would come to no harm on the way, she now sat in the station, waiting thankfully for the next train back to Lausanne. At the first bend in the road, Heidi and Jamie stopped to look at the splendid view. They could see the whole of Meienfeld, with its quaint low houses, tall spires, and busy streets. A flock of geese was being driven home. Ox carts rumbled along the street. There were some fine carriages, and the distant whistle of the departing train could be heard as the engine sent a white cloud of smoke puffing in its wake all down the valley. Above the town were rich pastures, filled with cattle and goats, and then rocks and pine forests, with more rocks and more pine forests above them. As they climbed higher up, the air became sharper, perfumed with herbs and flowers. The meadows were gay with colour. Then, at a turn in the road, they suddenly saw the Falkness illuminated by the last rays of the sun. It towered above the other peaks, majestic and awe-inspiring, as it reflected all the brilliance of the sky on its snow-capped pinnacle. Heidi stopped, right in the middle of the path, and tears of joy came into her eyes at the sight of her beloved mountains. Jamie stopped too. "Oh, how beautiful it is!" she cried. "Even the snow up there seems to be on fire. Now I understand your great love for the mountains, Heidi." They stood watching the sky until the splendour had faded. Now they realised how late it was growing and walked faster and faster in order to reach the village before it became quite dark. Suddenly, Jamie stopped, out of breath, and put her hand to her throat. "Oh, Heidi," she exclaimed, "I've lost something." "Your gold cross," Heidi cried out, seeing that her neck was bare. Usually, she wore a plain gold cross suspended from a narrow velvet ribbon, which was knotted behind and worn quite thin. The ribbon, apparently, had broken, and now the cross was gone. "I wouldn't have lost it for anything," wailed Jamie. "It belonged to my grandmother, and she asked me always to keep it. But now she is gone, and the cross was all I had to remember her by. Oh, what shall I do? My beautiful cross!" And all at once, Jamie was convulsed with sobs. She sat down on a rock that jutted out beside the path, and cried as though her heart would break. Heidi tried to comfort her in vain, and although they looked and looked, they could not find the cross. They retraced their steps all the way back to Meienfeld, searching along the path. There they borrowed a little lantern and returned, still searching. But there was no trace either of the cross or the ribbon that held it. "It's no use," Jamie said at last. "It's gone, and I'll never find it. I'll just not say anything more about it and try to have a nice vacation anyway." Heidi's sympathy this time was wordless as they climbed back along the path. They were both feeling very tired and very depressed, when suddenly, far above their heads, came the sound of joyous yodeling. The girls held up their lantern and looked, but could see no one, only the path zigzagging behind tall bushes and jutting rocks. Then a number of moving forms appeared among the bushes higher up, while the song rang out stronger and stronger. "Look, Heidi! Oh, look! Here! Oh, and over there! What is it?" cried Jamie, delighted, forgetting the lost locket and pointing excitedly. Before Heidi could turn around, 4 goats bounded down the slope. Others came into view behind them. Each one had a little bell around its neck, and the tinkling sounded on all sides. Now the goat herd rounded the bend, dancing in the middle of a group of cavorting goats and singing at the top of his lungs. The singer skipped and jumped on his bare feet as lightly and swiftly as the capricious goats, and in a moment he had reached the spot where the girls stood. "Good evening," he greeted them gaily. Then he paused to stare. But Heidi, who had recognized him at once, made one leap and fell into his arms. "Peter!" she cried. "Heidi! I never thought of meeting you here. My mother and the doctor were looking for you hours ago." "We were just—" Heidi began, but she saw Jamie place her finger to her lips as much as to say, "Don't tell him. There's no use spoiling everything because of a lost locket." "Why have you gone all the way down to Meienfeld?" Heidi asked. "I've added some new goats to my flock," the boy replied. "They belong to the schoolmaster, and I'm bringing them up from his stable in Meienfeld. This little one is almost too small for the journey," he added, lifting a small white kid in his arms and stroking its head. "Poor little Meckerli, is the day too long for you? Is the mountain too steep?" "What was it you called the little goat?" Jamie asked, coming closer to Peter. "Meckerli," he replied. "It means little one who bleats. All the goats have names, and all the names mean something. Heidi has told me about Schweinli and Bearli, her grandfather's goats. Are they in your flock?" "Little Swan and Little Bear," Peter replied. "No, not today, but tomorrow, if you go up on the mountain with Heidi, you shall see them." "Oh, I should love to go up," Jamie exclaimed. They set off for Dorfli together, and when they reached the village, Peter went first with his goats to see that they were stabled. But Heidi and Jamie ran on toward the house and arrived quite out of breath. The doctor was waiting for them in the doorway. He embraced Heidi tenderly and greeted Jamie with a friendly smile. Right away, Heidi wanted to know about her grandfather, and was delighted to hear that he was well and that the doctor had planned her trip so that she might surprise him in the morning. Brigitte had prepared a delicious supper of cheese and dried meat. Peter came in with a fresh pitcher of goat's milk and set it down on the table. "Come, Peter," said his mother, "you must be hungry." He sat down with them and helped himself to a large slice of cheese. Heidi had so much to tell about her life in school and all the little happenings of their trip with Mademoiselle Raymond that the evening passed quickly. Very early the next morning, Jamie was awakened by a song echoing across the village square. "It must be the goat herd," she cried, jumping out of bed and running to the window where Heidi was already looking out. They saw Peter, his cheeks fresh and pink, coming up the path with his little troop beside him. He snapped his whip to bring the goats to a halt and set his horn to his lips. Already, from the open doors of the stables, other goats hurried out to join the herd. "Hurry and dress," cried Brigitte, "if you want to go up with the doctor and Peter." 10 minutes later, the doctor, Jamie, and Heidi joined Peter and his flock, which now included all the goats from the whole village. He blew on his horn, and they started on up the mountain. Rosy early morning clouds were still in the sky, and the mountain air was fresh and sweet in their faces as they climbed. The higher they went, the more beautiful was the view. From time to time, Peter stole a look at Heidi to see if the school had changed her, and then smiled again in satisfaction to find that she was the same. Everything was new to Jamie, and she never once stopped asking questions. She wanted to know about the eternal snows, the name of all the flowers, and especially about the eagles, of which Heidi had so often spoken. Suddenly they came up from a turn in the path, and were in full sight of the grandfather's hut. "Why, it's just like you said!" Jamie cried in delight. And then she hugged Heidi in her excitement. But Heidi herself had seen the grandfather and broken away. "Grandfather! Grandfather!" she called out. "I'm home!" He turned from the bench beside the door where he was sitting, rubbed his arm across his face, as if to make sure a mist was not forming before his eyes. First he recognized his friend, the doctor. Then he saw Heidi, and his face broke into smiles, while the tears of joy rolled down his wrinkled cheeks. She ran to him and hugged him hard before she introduced her friend from school. "How do you like my surprise?" asked the doctor, shaking him by the hand. "Heidi and Jamie are here for a month. I know Heidi will want to be with you at first, but later today they plan to go up to the high pastures." "That's fine," said the grandfather. "Come, Peter, milk my goats, and we'll have a bite to eat." Heidi was already seated on the bench, her head pressed lovingly against his shoulder. "Did you know," the grandfather asked, stroking her soft hair, "that the greatest joy of my life is the Tuesday when Peter brings your letter to me? How happy I am to see you! Tell me, are you still planning to come back to Dorfli and teach when you finish school? Is it true that you want to stay here with me?" "Of course, grandfather," smiled Heidi. "I want to live in Dorfli for the rest of my life." The doctor stayed on with the grandfather to keep him company when Jamie and Heidi started off with Peter up to the pastures. Before long, they reached the place where Peter usually stopped for the goats to rest and graze. It was a little green plateau jutting out from the mountainside and commanding a view of the whole valley. Here Peter spent long hours, gazing out and whistling from time to time, while his animals munched the sweet grass. He carefully stowed his lunch away in a little dugout he had made so that the wind wouldn't blow it away, and invited the girls to place their lunches there too. Then he stretched himself out on the grass to enjoy the air and sunshine. The sky was a deep blue. All around rose the high mountain peaks shining with snow and ice, while far below the deep valley still lay in the shadows of early morning. Heidi and Jamie, sitting together on the high plateau, felt the wind blow sharp and cool in their faces. Above their heads, birds circled in the air. Neckerly, Peter's new pet, came close to rub his head against the girls, making little friendly bleats. Then he danced over to Peter and rubbed up against his shoulder. One by one, the other goats came over to make friends. Each had his own manner of greeting. Jamie was enchanted with all of them. Barely, the darker one of the grandfather's two goats, examined each person separately with an anxious air. Then she stood perfectly still and stared until she was told, "Yes, yes, Barely, that's fine. You may go back and browse." Peter recited the names of all the goats, and Jamie seemed surprised that he could keep them all in his head. These difficult names seemed harder to her than a history lesson at school. While they were being named, the goats capered about, full of mischief. Schweinli and Distelfink, who was thin and slender of build, would charge, both together at Peter, and bowl him over if he was not stretched flat on the ground. Donnerkeil, the mother of Meckerli, was very proud. She came within 2 feet of the strangers and raised her head to look them over with an air of someone who disdains familiarities, afterwards walking away with great dignity. The Turk, who was the oldest billy goat and thus felt his importance, butted all the other goats out of his way, and then stood bleating grandly to show that he was chief over the herd and meant to keep the others in order. But Meckerli refused to be pushed about. When the big goat came near him, he would run to Peter for protection. There he felt perfectly safe, although if he met the old Turk alone, he trembled from head to foot. And so the sunny morning passed. Peter pulled out his lunch and stood quietly leaning on his stick, eating and thinking, while the girls unpacked the lunch the grandfather had fixed for them. After lunch, Peter decided he would like to try a new way to the higher slopes, for that afternoon he planned to take his little troop farther up the mountain. He finally decided on the left path, because on that side was a meadow with little bushes that the goats particularly loved. The path was steep, especially near the top, and there were some dangerous places along the edge of the cliff. But Peter knew the way well, and he hoped the goats, remembering the good meal which awaited them at the top, would follow closely and not stray off. He led the way up the rocks, and the girls followed, while the goats climbed the difficult places with ease, one after another. Little Meckerli stayed close to Peter. From time to time the goat herd would catch him by the neck and pull him up over the steep rocks. At last they all reached the grazing place safely, and the goats began to nibble eagerly at their favourite plants and bushes. Jamie almost held her breath as she stood there on top of what seemed to be the whole world. She could not have imagined a more beautiful spot. The air was filled with the scent of alpine flowers which grew everywhere. Vanilla orchids, fringed gentians, little blue harebells, primroses and jonquils, and she picked a whole armful of golden rock roses. "Easy, easy there," said Peter to the goats. "Be quiet and don't butt one another. In a minute one of you will be at the bottom of a ravine with his legs broken. Distelfink, where do you think you're going?" he cried, glancing up the rocks. The lithe little animal, called Distelfink, had climbed out onto a steep rock ledge. Another step, and she would be over. Peter scrambled after her as quickly as he could. In a few seconds he reached the jutting rock, seized the impudent Distelfink by one leg, and dragged her back. Heidi was close behind him, remembering how it was this goat had always given him trouble. Between them they led her down to join the others, but Peter held on to her until he was quite sure that her mind was on her grazing again, and not on further escapades. "But where is Meckerli?" cried Jamie. Donnerkeil, the little kid's mother, was standing all alone, staring down over the edge of the cliff. Jamie had noticed that when the kid was not with Peter, he always followed closely beside his mother. "What have you done with your baby, Donnerkeil?" asked Heidi, running up to her in alarm. Donnerkeil acted very strangely. She wasn't grazing, just standing perfectly still, her ears pricked forward as if listening. Peter looked down. He heard a feeble, sad little bleat below, a tiny, piping voice calling for help. "Don't cry, little Meckerli, I'm coming," he called, as if speaking to a child. Stretching full length on his stomach, he peered over the edge. Far below him, something moved. Then he saw his little pet dangling from a branch growing out of a crevice in the rock. He was crying pitifully. The branch had stopped his fall. Even now, if the branch gave way, he would fall and break his little bones. Trembling with anxiety, Peter called down, "Hold on, Meckerli! Stick to your branch! We're coming to get you!" But how could they reach him? Peter saw immediately that it was hopeless to attempt to climb down from where he was. The ledge of rock was clean cut and offered no possible footing. But Heidi pointed to the rock below. The Rainy Day Rock, she called it, because she and Peter had often found shelter there during a storm. Peter might be able to reach Meckerley if he climbed up from there. It was a good suggestion, and Peter was already heading down the path. "Jamie, look after the goats. We're going to rescue Meckerley," cried Heidi, running after him. Fearlessly, the boy climbed up the rocks without once looking down until he neared the branch. There he planted his 2 bare feet solidly against the Rainy Day Rock and, reaching up, managed to grasp the trembling, frightened animal and hand him down to Heidi, who was just below him. Once they were back in the meadow, Peter was overjoyed, and Heidi breathed a prayer of thankfulness as they both sat down on the ground to caress and calm the frightened little animal. It was now nearly time to go home, so they went back to the plateau and found Jamie anxiously guarding the rest of the flock. She felt quite pleased with herself that none of the goats had strayed. At the sound of Peter's horn, all the goats started to move. Heidi had an errand to do for the grandfather in the village, so she and Jamie went with Peter all the way down to Dorfley. Here Peter brought his goats to a halt beside the village fountain, and once more blew on his horn. At once children came running from all directions to sort out their own family goats from the rest. In no time at all, the little herd had disappeared. Peter left the girls then and went home singing. Heidi did her errand, and she and Jamie trudged back up the mountain to the grandfather's hut, talking and laughing all the way. "Grandfather," begged Heidi when they were sitting around the table after supper that evening, "won't you tell Jamie some of your wonderful stories? I have promised her that by the time she returns to school, she will know almost as many old legends as I do." "Those legends are long," the grandfather said, "and you have had a hard day in the pastures. I save my stories for rainy days, but," he added, much pleased, "I believe it will rain tomorrow." The Alm Uncle was rarely wrong in prophesying the weather. The next morning, though the sky was clear, Peter left very early, carrying a raincoat over his arm, and the girls did not go with him. Around noon, heavy clouds rolled overhead and the storm broke. Peter found shelter for himself and his goats under the Rainy Day Rock as usual. To his surprise, another goat herd was there, but without his goats. It was Gerard from Ragaz. The 2 boys stood still for a moment, and then they greeted each other with a hearty "Hello!" "I didn't know you came all the way up here with your goats," the other boy said to Peter. "Sometimes," Peter replied, "but not every day. Usually I stop in the first meadow or round about there. Why did you come up here?" "I wanted to see you. I have to pick up 2 goats from you to take to Ragaz, where they've been sold." "Are they your goats?" asked Peter. "Yes, I don't keep goats for anyone else. I'm no longer a goat herd," announced Gerard rather proudly. This surprised Peter. As Gerard had once been elected goat herd, Peter could not conceive of him not continuing the job. But instead, he spoke as if being a herdsman was an unworthy occupation, something to be ashamed of. While the 2 boys were talking, the clouds lifted again and the sun came out. Peter decided it would be a good time to eat his lunch. He invited Gerard to share it with him. Talking as they went, they reached the dugout where he'd stowed it away, and Peter brought out his sack filled with bread and ham and cheese. With a flat stone for a table, they sat down to eat with good appetites. After they had eaten all there was in the sack and drunk 2 bowls of fresh goat's milk, Gerard stretched back, leaning on his elbows. Peter sat still, looking off into the depths of the valley. "What do you do at Ragaz if you are no longer a goat herd?" he asked. "I sell eggs," said Gerard. "Every day I take my eggs around to the inns as far as I can. I sell them to the hotels, too." Peter tossed his head in disdain. "I would not want to sell eggs. I would 1,000 times rather be a goat herd. It's a much better thing to do." "How do you make that out?" asked Gerard. "Eggs aren't alive. They don't follow you around all day like the goats do. They aren't glad to see you when you come and get them in the morning. They don't rub up against you and understand everything you say to them," said Peter. "You can't possibly love your eggs the way I love my goats." "And what do you get out of it?" interrupted Gerard. "Only a few coins a week at the most. and you had to jump up at least 6 times while we were eating, simply for that little good-for-nothing kid you're so afraid might fall. Is that fun?" "Of course," said Peter promptly. "I do it willingly, don't I, Meckerly? Your little legs are so unsteady, and you are still very small." And again he led his pet away from the edge of the cliff where he was always straying. When he came back and sat down, Gerard observed, "There's another way to keep the goats from falling down on the rocks without always running after them." "What way is that?" asked Peter. "Plant a stick in the ground and tie the goat by the leg. She'll carry on badly, it's true, but she won't get away." "Do you think for a minute that I'd ever do that?" said Peter indignantly, and pulling Meckerly towards him, he held him tightly in his arms, as though he would protect him always from such cruel treatment. "Well, you won't be bothered with that one much longer," continued Gerard. "He has only a few more days to come up here." "How do you know that?" demanded Peter with a start. "The schoolmaster doesn't want to raise him," said Gerard. "He's not strong, and will never make a solid goat that's worth his keep. So the hotel keeper at Meienfeld told me to bring him over next week." Peter turned pale. At first he couldn't utter a word, but then he exploded with grief. "They wouldn't dare!" he cried. "I wouldn't let them!" "Look here," Gerard said, facing him about suddenly. "If the kid means that much to you, maybe I can get my father to buy him, but you'll have to do something for me first." And Gerard held out something in one hand, which he half covered with the other. It was something that sparkled between his fingers where the sun shone on it. "What is it?" asked Peter. "Guess," answered Gerard. "I found it on the path down to Meienfeld." "Oh, then it doesn't belong to you," said Peter. "Why not? I didn't take it from anyone. I almost stepped on it yesterday when I came up from peddling the eggs. I could easily have broken it. Since I didn't, I guess I can keep it." "But someone has lost it," Peter insisted, "and you should put up a notice." "No, I won't do that," cried Gerard, alarmed that Peter should take this attitude. "Look at it. It's solid gold. The shopkeeper in the village will be glad to buy it if you'll take it there and sell it for me. We can split the money and no one will ever know." "I won't do it," said Peter quickly. Gerard now regretted having told Peter anything about his find, but it was too late to do anything about it. He would have to think of another way out of the difficulty. "Peter," he said suddenly, "I will ask my father to buy Meckerly anyway if you will promise not to say anything about this. Then the schoolmaster cannot have him killed." Gerard had opened his hand, and Peter had seen the thick gold cross lying in his palm. He knew it was valuable, and that certainly someone would claim it. Inwardly, he was having a difficult conflict. He knew that if he said nothing, it would be as though he were keeping something which did not belong to him. But on the other hand, there was his little Meckerly, who would be unmercifully sacrificed to the butcher, and he could prevent that by keeping silence. The kid came over and lay down at Peter's side, looking trustfully into his face, as though he was sure that the boy would always protect him. Peter couldn't let the little thing die. A goat's life was worth more than a cross of gold, or the coins Gerard had promised him if he sold it. And he was buying Meckerly's right to live, only with silence. "All right, I accept," he said dully. Gerard seemed quite content with the bargain. As Peter had apparently nothing more to say, and he had a long road before him, Gerard decided to go on with the 2 goats. So he said goodbye. When he was gone, Peter called his troop together and also started down the mountain, but he was lost in thought and did not once whistle or sing. The next morning, Peter passed silently and disconsolately through the village. He called out the goats and went on his way up the mountain without singing a note, without one joyful yodel. He trudged along, his head hanging as if he were afraid, and from time to time he turned around as though someone might be following to question him. Peter himself could not understand his own misery. He was rejoiced to have saved Meckerly's life. He wanted to sing as he always did, but the song stuck in his throat. The sky was heavy too, and Peter decided that it was because of the dismal day he felt so sad. He now persuaded himself that when the sun shone out again, he would be gay once more. No sooner had he reached the meadow than it started to pour. He sought refuge under the rainy day rock and watched the rain fall in torrents. Lightning flashed across the sky, and the thunder rolled. The goats came up too, and stood close under the rocks to the right and left. Distelfink, always so delicate, wanted to protect her beautiful shining coat, and came to sit under the rocky arch in front of Peter. From her comfortable corner, she looked peacefully at the rain. Meckerli stood close by his protector under the rock. Rubbing his head tenderly against Peter's knees, he looked up at him as though surprised because, for the first time, Peter was silent, paying no attention to him. Bearly, too, scratched the earth with her little hoofs and bleated as much as to say, "All morning you have not said a single word to us." Deep in his thoughts, Peter stood leaning on his stick. He had lots of time to think things over as he stood for hours under the rock. He turned over in his mind the promise he had made to Gerard, and the more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that, since the other boy was keeping something which did not belong to him, he himself was guilty because he had sold his silence. He had done something which was not right. He was overcome with remorse. "I will tell," he resolved at last. But then he saw the butcher's knife hanging over little Meckerli's head, and that picture was just as clear as the other. So the torrent increased, and the weight on his conscience grew and grew. Thus the whole day passed. In the evening he returned as silent as when he left. Heidi and Jamie were waiting for him and ran out to the stable. "Peter, what's the matter?" they asked. "Why don't you sing any more?" He turned around grimly. "I can't," he answered shortly, and went on his way as fast as he could without looking back. "It is very strange that he doesn't sing or whistle any more," Jamie said thoughtfully. "Something has certainly happened to him." "It's this awful rain that puts him in a bad humour," decided Heidi. "Or else he is vexed because you are here, and he doesn't have me to himself any more." The next day was as gloomy as the day before. The sky was overcast. Peter went about with the same heavy weight on his conscience. He sat down under the same rock, and his thoughts turned around in the same circle. No sooner had he decided to tell everything he knew about the cross than he saw the butcher's knife on little Meckerli's throat, and he began all over again. When evening came, he was so exhausted with thinking and nothing resolved that he walked along sadly and slowly in the steady downpour. The schoolmaster, standing in his doorway, called out to him in the sharp tone he used to bring his pupils to attention. "Come along more quickly with those animals. They're already wet enough. Why do you walk along like a tortoise? The villagers will want a new goat boy if you cannot be trusted." On the following day, the sky cleared and the sun shone through. It seemed to Peter that God was looking straight down at him from the blue depths of heaven. The advice of his blind grandmother came back to him clearly. Long ago, when he had first gone up to the pastures, she had drawn him aside and said in her gentle yet certain voice, "Remember, Peter, up there on the elm you are very near to heaven. God will see and hear everything you do and say. You cannot hide anything from him. But also he is nearer to you and can help you. Since you are too far away to call anyone else if something should happen, call on him. He will hear you and surely come." So at last it became perfectly clear to Peter what he must do. "Forgive me, Meckerli," he cried over and over as he helped the little goat down from the pasture. "Dear God, I must be sure I'm doing right, but please, please don't let Meckerli die." When Peter stopped at the grandfather's hut, the old man looked up and asked with deep concern, "What is it now, unhappy goat general? Heidi has been telling me that you have lost your voice." "I have something to confess," said Peter, hanging his head. "Out with it then," the old man prompted him. "Something was found," replied Peter, speaking with great difficulty. "Something found?" Jamie started up from the table where they had just sat down to supper. "I lost something too, my beautiful gold cross." "Yes, that's what it was," said Peter. "What are you saying? Was it a thick gold cross on a velvet ribbon?" asked Jamie excitedly. "Where did you find it?" said Heidi. "It wasn't I who found it," Peter said. "It was Gerard of Ragatz." Jamie wanted to know all about it and suggested sending someone for Gerard right away. "I will be glad to go myself," said Peter. "In fact, I think I should go. If he still has it, I will bring it back." "But why shouldn't he have it?" exclaimed Jamie. "What could he possibly do with it?" "How did he find it?" asked Heidi. "And how did you know about it?" But Peter kept his eyes on the floor and was afraid to tell. Before he left, however, Heidi took him aside, and he told her the whole story. "Dearest Peter," she said when he had finished, "if it had not been for what the grandmother told you, you might have kept this secret, mightn't you?" "Yes," he confessed, "I might. But now Meckerli will be killed." Heidi smiled. "Didn't you ever think of buying him yourself, Peter? Didn't you ever think of owning your goats instead of just keeping them for other people? Nearly every man in Dorfli owns his goats." Peter pondered this a moment and left for Gerard's in a thoughtful mood. Jamie had promised Gerard an even larger reward than he would have received if Peter had sold the cross and they'd split the money between them. He was angry at first when he heard that Peter had told, but the reward soon pacified him, and he surrendered the cross. It was too late for Peter to climb back up the mountain with it that night, so he took it home with him to keep until the following morning. Before he went to bed, he carefully counted out what money he had. It wasn't half enough to buy the kid. The schoolmaster was stern and would sell him for no less than he would receive from the hotel keeper. In the future, however, Peter resolved to save and buy his own goats, as Heidi had suggested. But that would be too late to save Meckerli. The next morning, very early, Peter arrived with his band of goats and silently handed Jamie her treasured cross. Then he went up on the mountain to the pastures. When he returned in the afternoon, Jamie ran to meet him. "Why are you still so sad, Peter?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'm thinking of my little goat. How much longer will he be alive, my little Meckerli?" His face wore such a woebegone expression that Jamie was touched and decided to keep her surprise a secret from him no longer. "Do you know how happy you've made me, Peter?" she asked. "Without you, Gerard would never have returned the cross. So now I want to make you happy too. Today, while you were up in the pastures, Heidi and I went together to see the schoolmaster. I wanted to give you a reward, and the nicest reward I could think of was little Meckerli. Pick him out of the flock now, Peter, and take him home. He belongs to you." For a moment, Peter was so surprised he could only stare at Jamie. Then he found his voice and thanked her 1,000 times, and Heidi too, for Heidi confessed the idea had been hers. As he swung down the path with his goats, Peter started to sing, and never before had he sung so gladly. His voice rang out across the valley, bursting with joy. The sun shone brightly in the blue sky, the grass was fresher and greener than ever after the 3 days of rain, and all the flowers bloomed in their brightest colours. It seemed to Peter that never before had the mountain, the valley, the whole world been so lovely. He felt he couldn't hold all the happiness in his heart. It was still early when Peter and his troop arrived in the village. Brigitte heard him shouting to her before he was in the house, "He belongs to me! Meckerli is mine! Meckerli will not die!" He stopped first at the stable where he fixed a soft bed for his pet. Then he went into the kitchen, and as he ate, with an excellent appetite, he told his mother of everything that had happened. Brigitte listened patiently to the long story, and when he had finished, she said, "Peterkin, all your life long, remember these last few hours. Be guided by your conscience. You would have done so this time if you had thought of the people who trust you before you thought of the little goat." The summer passed all too quickly. Jamie found the grandfather's stories far more interesting and entertaining than anything she'd learned later from her school books. By the end of her vacation, she knew the history of Switzerland with its many beautiful legends and alpine songs almost as well as Heidi and Peter. When September came, Heidi and Jamie returned to school. The trees were hung with yellow leaves, Lessons began, and Mademoiselle Larby planned several autumn walks. One afternoon, the pupils went to visit the chateau of Chillon, where Bonnivard was imprisoned for 6 years, and they saw the path worn in the stone floor by the feet of the condemned man chained in his small cell. Heidi wrote to the grandfather about it, and was shocked and hurt beyond words when he wrote back that there were many cells like it. In Dorfli, he said, the prison was much the same. Heidi had always known there was a prison in Dorfli, but she had thought of it before as necessary and right. Now it seemed unmerciful and cruel. She wondered what sort of people were kept there. "When I go home to Dorfli," she announced to her schoolmates, "I'm going to do something about the prison. People aren't meant to be caged up like animals in the zoo. It isn't right." "What are you going to do?" they laughed. "Go and play music for the prisoners?" "I might," she retorted. "Why shouldn't I?" They joked about it and called her a little crusader. "She's going to cheer up the prisoners, and teach the girls in Dorfli how to sew and knit, and the boys how to read, and marry the little goat boy," Eileen finished sarcastically. "Is it such an awful life?" Jamie said wistfully. "I'd gladly change mine for it." Even Eileen, who had looked down on Heidi, became a little envious as she listened to more and more tales of the summer at Dorfli. And when Heidi left for home, at the end of her stay at school, the good wishes of all her schoolmates went with her. One summer evening, as the peaks of the Falkness were illuminated by the last rays of the sun, Heidi sat at the window of her room in the grandfather's house, looking out across the valley. Her heart was filled with longing, and yet she wanted nothing more than to stay right where she was, so that every evening she could watch the splendor of the mountains, and every night the music of the pines and larch trees could lull her to sleep. Her thoughts were very far away when suddenly she saw Peter walking up the path with a letter in his hand. It bore an official stamp, and when Heidi opened it, she found it was an answer to her application to teach the village school. Neighbours in the village had advised her against making the application. The school was a disgrace, they said. Nobody could manage the unruly children, least of all an inexperienced girl like Heidi. But she felt certain that if the children in the school were loved and understood, they would respond in turn with love and understanding. The schoolhouse where Heidi was to teach was just at the foot of the white-capped Falkness. She came early on the first day and stood by the window looking out on the green pastures and pine trees and rolling slopes of the opposite mountain. She loved this view from her window. A pot of sweet-smelling mignonette bloomed on her window-sill. She had brought it down from the house on the elm, and the grandfather had planted it. She could see him moving about now, a little black speck on the green mountain. It was good to be so near him, when if she had gone to Paris to study the violin as Monsieur Rochard and Clara had both wanted her to, she would be so far away. She could see Tony, the new little goat-herd, on the mountain too. Peter was no longer there. He had a fine flock of his own goats now, and kept them, for the present, in the doctor's stable. The new goat boy, Heidi thought, should be in school. She glanced at the schoolhouse clock and found it was already late, but her classroom was empty. Silence was everywhere except for the ticking of the clock. Outside, not a child was in sight, with the exception of Tony minding his goats. 9 o'clock passed, and then 10 o'clock. Noon went by without one child, boy or girl, putting in an appearance. The afternoon was just the same. Gathering her things together, Heidi was about to leave the school when a tumult of voices sounded outside. Going to the window, she saw an army of children heading down the path towards the school, crying at the top of their lungs, "Let me see it! Let me see it! If you didn't steal it, what are you hiding it for?" "I'll tell the shopkeeper on you," one voice rang out louder than the others. "He'll put you in prison, and that's worse than the dungeon." The boy who was running ahead turned around, and Heidi, watching from her window, could see a look of wild terror in his eyes. Throwing open the window, she called out, "Stop!" at the top of her voice. "Look out, Chell!" one of the children cried. "There's the teacher at her window looking out at you. Just wait until you get in school. She'll put you in the dungeon." "What dungeon were they talking about? Heidi wondered. Determined to find out, she again called out to the children. Chell raised his head, saw her, ducked again, and a moment later someone in the group had picked up a stone and sent it flying toward the window. Heidi drew back just in time. Instead of striking her, it struck the flower pot, sending pieces of pottery flying in all directions. The beautiful mignonette fell to the floor, broken. The whole group of children stopped dead still and stared, and then scattered like frightened rabbits, and the school was as quiet as it had been before. Walking sadly over to the window, Heidi picked up the pieces of her flower pot. What could cause children to act like that? Had the old schoolmaster frightened them out of their reason? Or was it the dungeon? Heidi looked about her. The schoolroom was the same as she remembered it, except for the scratched desktops and the broken blackboard. A heating stove was in the centre, then the 6 rows of desks, 3 on either side of the stove. She remembered how, on cold days, the children used to huddle next to the heat. The schoolroom had been a comforting place then. The schoolmistress had been kind. But with the schoolmaster came a reign of terror, and Heidi could easily understand the change. Punishment had been his first thought whenever anything went wrong. But could he have been cruel enough to put children in a dungeon? And if so, where was it? The schoolhouse had but 1 room and 2 cloakrooms at either side of the teacher's desk, one for the girls and one for the boys. Heidi opened the door of one of these, and found that all the hooks had been removed, and that the little window had boards nailed across it. "This must be the dungeon," she exclaimed, and closed the door quickly. No wonder the children were afraid to come to school. The next day the schoolroom was deserted, and the following day also. Heidi was no longer surprised, but something had to be done about it. She waited until the morning of the 4th day. Then she walked over to the house on the big rocks where she knew the school warden lived. Just before she reached his house, she suddenly found herself face to face with little curly-haired Germaine Gruber, whom she knew should have been in school. The child stopped in surprise. Her hands flew to her head as she attempted to cover her tangled mop of hair. "Are you the new teacher?" she gasped. "You mustn't see me. Mamma said so. I'm not fit to come to school and meet a lady teacher." And the poor child began to cry bitterly, as though even now she might be punished for her ragged appearance. "There's Mamma now," she sobbed at length, pointing to a woman coming along the path towards the house, with a shovel over one shoulder and carrying a basket of dead wood over her arm. The woman would have passed her by, but Heidi stepped out into the road and spoke directly to her. "Frau Gruber, I am the new teacher, and I have come to find out why the children do not go to school." "We hear there was a fight," the woman said, leaning on her shovel. "I want the girls to wait until the beating is over. I don't wish them to see it." "But there will be no beating," Heidi exclaimed. "I have no intention of punishing the child who broke my flower pot. I'm sure it was an accident and had best be forgotten." "But if you do find out," Germaine ventured, peering from behind her mother's skirts, "you'll put Chell in a dungeon, and we'll have to hear him scream." "I won't put Chell or anybody else in the dungeon," Heidi said firmly. "We won't be using the dungeon this year. I intend to have it made back into a cloakroom." "Even so," said Germaine's mother, "I cannot send the children to school. When one has to work from morning to night, it is impossible to find the time to wash and dress them properly. A lady teacher will expect them to be combed and washed and have all their clothes mended." "But what makes you think that?" said Heidi in surprise. "The schoolmaster forced them to go," said the woman. "Otherwise I wouldn't have sent them looking the way they do." "I hope I shall not need to force them," Heidi said gently. "Please send them tomorrow. I will see that they are washed and combed at the school." "Oh, you're very kind," the woman murmured. Heidi bade her good evening and walked on to the warden's house. She found him sitting on the doorstep enjoying his pipe while his wife prepared his dinner. "I came to ask you what I must do," Heidi began. "The children are not coming to school. They seem frightened to death of being locked in the dungeon. Did you know, Warden, that the old schoolmaster had fitted out a prison in the school cloakroom?" "Yes," he replied calmly. "I knew it. I always leave the teachers to their own methods of punishment." "But that is horrible," Heidi cried. "The old schoolmaster was cruel. It was his nature to be cruel, for he was even cruel to his goats. I believe children can be governed better by kindness." The warden laughed dryly. "Get them to come to school and maybe they can. Shall I send an officer after them?" "Thank you, no," Heidi replied. "We must not frighten them any more than they have been frightened. I think they will come by themselves." Disheartened, she walked home to the doctor's house, where she always stopped for her midday meal. Around the table she talked over her difficulties with Peter and Brigitte and the doctor. It grieved them all that Heidi was not happy with her school as she'd hoped to be. "You should have taken my advice," the doctor said, "and kept up your studies with the violin." "And you were doing very well with your drawing, too," Brigitte put in. "But Monsieur Rochard told me I'd never make a musician, and I'm sure I could never be an artist." "What do you want me to be?" Heidi asked suddenly, turning to Peter. "I don't like school teachers," he replied, and that was all the answer he would give. "But Peter, I taught you once," she insisted, "and children must be taught." "Try it a little longer," Brigitte said kindly. "The villagers are discouraged now, and the children are frightened because of the old schoolmaster. And don't listen to Peter. The oxen put him in a bad temper." "Ah, so it's the oxen, is it?" "They're harder to manage than the goats," confessed Peter. Nevertheless, as Peter drove his new ox cart down to Meienfeld, where he marketed the milk from his fine flock of goats, Heidi felt her heart swell with pride. What better thing could a boy do than keep his own oxen and milk his own goats, and sell the milk to be made into fine cheeses? Gerard, with his egg business, could no longer scoff at Peter, for his herd had been started with the schoolmaster's one weak little goat, which Gerard had thought only fit for the butcher. Later, when the schoolmaster left Dorfli, Peter had bought the teacher's whole flock with the money he managed to save. But Peter was unhappy in the village. The doctor's big house seemed to be shut in from all sides, and often he too was filled with longing. To go back on the mountain was his one great ambition. He was saving money again, but when he spoke to his mother about the new house he planned to build on the Alm, she said, "But why, Peter? The doctor is glad to have us here." "We can't look out," he said, "and the street is noisy and the goats are away all day in the pasture while I must drive the stupid oxen to town. I tell you, it's like being clamped down under a cover. I'm going up to the uncle's. He knows what it is to have freedom, and up there I can breathe." The Alm uncle was firm in his determination not to come down to the village for the winter. Heidi was uneasy about him until she heard of Peter's frequent visits. "He says to tell you he has God and the goats and the pine trees for company," Peter told her. "And you are not to worry. He is not alone." But she knew he was only thinking of her good when, in his heart, he longed for companionship. During the first days of school, she often wondered why she had decided to teach at all. When Heidi came to school the morning after she had seen the warden, she found a group of little girls waiting for her. They came into the schoolroom slowly, each one trying to hide behind the others. Finally, one asked, "You're not going to beat the boy who broke the flower pot, are you?" Heidi shook her head, smiling slowly. And you're not going to put him in the dungeon?" "There isn't any dungeon in the school," Heidi said. "It's a cloakroom now. As soon as we have a window in it again, you can have it for your wraps." The girls seemed pleased at this, but they still stood around twisting their fingers as if there was something more they wanted to say. Finally, Germaine explained it. "They want to be combed and washed. I told them you said you'd comb their hair, and they want it like yours." Heidi laughed out loud from sheer relief. "I'm delighted," she said at length. "You can't think I'm such a fearful person if you want your hair fixed like mine. Now, how many of you know how to make a braid?" By the looks of their tousled heads, none of them knew how to make a braid very well. They all said they wanted to learn. "That will be our first lesson, then. I want you all to form a line with the largest girl first, so that you make steps down to the smallest." Pushing a little, and laughing a great deal, the girls rushed to do as they were told. When they were all in line, they followed Heidi to the fountain, where, one by one, she washed their hands, their arms, and their heads. Then she stood them in the sun to dry their hair, while she went to her desk to get a comb. Dividing each girl's hair into even strands, she made exactly 8 glossy braids. "There," she said, looking over her glowing accomplishment. "Now you know how to braid your own hair." Her labour was well spent. The children looked from one to the other, laughing and happy, and each one appeared transformed. "Now," said Heidi, when they were again standing in line, "I am going to tell you a little secret. We can't have any regular lessons until the boys come back to school, so we will put the books aside and learn something new. How many of you know how to knit and sew? Raise your hands." Not one hand went up. "Very well," concluded Heidi. "Each one of you bring a torn dress with you tomorrow, or a stocking, or vest, or a little shirt, and we will begin to sew. Those of you who are good, who do what I say and try to learn quickly, will receive a comb as a reward. Now you may go and spend the day as you please." The little girls ran off down the path, looking from one to another as if they could hardly believe such kindness had been shown to them. After the schoolmaster's harsh discipline, it was indeed a change. Word spread rapidly that the new teacher was gentle and kind, and was teaching the girls exactly the sort of things that industrious girls needed to know. But it had been a boy who broke the flower pot, and so each boy, fearing he would be blamed, waited for the others to come to school first. The sewing and knitting lessons had now been going on for 8 days. The promise of new combs worked like a charm. Each little girl was eager for her reward. Several of them, indeed, had already received it. The class had the wholehearted approval of all the mothers, and each day new pupils arrived. Heidi, busy with her needle, was patching a torn vest here, darning a stocking there, when suddenly a terrible racket sounded in front of the school. She ran to the window and saw a group of boys yelling and shouting names. In the middle of this fracas, 2 men were trying to drag away a boy who struggled furiously, biting, kicking, scratching and fighting with such energy that the 2 men, even with the help of all the screaming boys, were unable to move him. Finally, overcome by numbers, he let out a despairing cry which went straight to Heidi's heart. Pushing her way through the crowd, she faced the men who were struggling with the boy. She recognized him as Chell, the one who had caused the other fracas when her pot of mignonette had been broken. "What has he done?" she demanded. "Where are you trying to take him?"
"What hasn't he done?" cried one man. "This time he even attacked the warden who ordered him to be punished. We're bringing him to the school dungeon."
No, not the dungeon," screamed the child. "I tell you, I never did it. I wouldn't hurt Distelfink for the world." "Distelfink?" exclaimed Heidi, more puzzled than ever. "What has the warden's goat got to do with all this?"
"Chell wounded her," the man explained. "He threw stones at her and broke her leg so she can't walk. And when the warden scolded him for it, he threw stones at him too. He should be punished well for that."
"Perhaps," said Heidi, "but he certainly should not be put in a dungeon. Why, that room in the school has no air or light with the window boarded up the way it is. I wouldn't put a beast in there, much less a child." "But I didn't do it," the boy insisted.
"Well, what did happen to the goat then?" one of the men demanded, turning on him angrily. "Her leg's broken all right. She can't walk. She just lies on the straw, trembling, and the veterinary's away and can't be reached till tomorrow."
"Poor Distelfink," murmured Chell, who seemed to have forgotten himself, thinking of the little goat. "Why don't you explain what did happen, Chell?" Heidi asked gently. The boy shook his head sadly and made no reply.
"This is what happened," the first man said. "The goat disappeared from the pasture. Later in the evening she returned to her stable, limping and half dead. Her broken leg was bound up with a tie, which the boys recognized at once as belonging to Chell. He wrapped up her leg, thinking that no one would notice it."
"No, that's wrong," interrupted Chell. "I did it so she could get back to the stable without her leg hurting so much."
You hear? He admits having touched the goat," exclaimed the second man.
"You knew then that the goat had a broken leg?" Heidi asked Chell, who she instinctively believed innocent. "How did it happen if a stone did not hit her?" "She fell off the rock," replied Chell sadly. Heidi could easily believe that, remembering the many narrow escapes the goat had had when Peter was the village goatherd.
"If she fell off the rock, how did she climb up again?" asked one of the onlookers. And how could you tie up her leg at the bottom of the rocks?"
"I climbed down to her and helped her up," said Chell.
"Ah, you hear what he says now?" the man addressed the crowd. "You weren't even near the goats in the meadow, or the goat herd would have seen you."
"Now, no one knows whether he is really to blame for the goats being wounded or not," said Heidi, "and he should not be punished until we are sure he's guilty. In the meantime, why don't you leave him with me? I will take him to Dr. Rebu, who I'm sure will gladly be responsible for him." The men agreed to this, apparently relieved to have the youngster off their hands. Heidi's sewing class was upset for the day, so she dismissed the girls and took Chell directly to the doctor's house. He walked the whole distance in silence, but at the door he suddenly tried to jerk away. But the doctor appeared in time, and Heidi announced gaily, "Here is the prodigal son, Doctor. Have you killed the fatted calf?" "This boy has been pretty badly frightened," she added more seriously, "and he would probably appreciate a soft bed for the night, after he has stowed away a little bread and cheese. Do you think you could manage it?" "I'll try. Come on, son. Nobody's going to hurt you," the good man assured him. "What's all this trouble you've been having? Let's talk it over and get the story straight." Chell glanced up at the doctor with his half-frightened, half-savage brown eyes, and then turned away as though to avoid looking him in the face as he repeated the same confused story he had told outside the school. "You understand, Chell, that I want to help you?" the doctor asked when he'd finished. "Yes," said Chell, "but I don't know why." "Because," the doctor replied, "I was once a boy just your size, and I know how it feels to be accused of something you haven't done. I also know how it feels to have done something wrong and be scared to death that somebody will find out. So you see, you can speak to me frankly as though I were your father. Did you tell the truth?" Chell seemed more and more surprised, as though he could hardly understand the doctor's words. He was silent, looking long and questioningly into his face. Then, as though he were coming out of a dream, he breathed deeply and said in a clear voice, "Yes, I told the truth. I didn't throw a stone at Distel Fink's leg. She's the most beautiful goat in the neighborhood, and I wouldn't hurt her for anything." "I believe you," the doctor said, "but I still don't understand. They say that the goat herd would have seen you if you'd gone to the pasture where the goats were grazing." "That is not where I was. Distel Fink did not fall from that side," protested Chell. I still don't understand. The goat was with the herd. Where could she have fallen then?" "Did you see her fall?" asked Heidi. "No, I heard her bleating down there on the rocks," Chell answered painfully, avoiding Heidi's eyes. "And where were you then?" the doctor asked. The boy was silent. "Listen, Chell," Heidi said, taking him by the hand. "It's for your own good that the doctor is asking you these questions. If he can explain to the warden, who is so angry with you, then you will not be punished. And if you have done something wrong and are truly sorry, he will see that you are not punished either. And in any case, you won't be put in the dungeon. Nobody is to be put in the dungeon while I teach the school. Do you still not want to tell the doctor what happened, where you were, and where the goat fell, so he can explain to the others?" Chell lowered his eyes again and shook his head. "We'll let it rest now," the doctor said kindly. "He may feel differently about it after he's had some food." Early the next morning, when the doctor went into his room, Chell was so absorbed by a little painting which hung on the wall that he didn't hear his footsteps. The doctor went over to him, and he jumped and turned around as if he'd been caught doing something forbidden. "Do you like it?" asked the doctor. "Yes, the white is beautiful. Those flowers are all white. I don't know what they are." The doctor studied his face for a moment. Beneath his savage expression, there seemed to be almost a spiritual look, as though the boy had been surprised while kneeling at the altar in a church. After breakfast, Chell went back to his room, and the doctor gave him a book. "I have a call to make," he said, "and you must stay here until I return. You are not to leave this house until the warden has had an explanation of the accident to his goat. That is what I promised, so you see, this house is really your prison." "I like it here," said Chell, looking about him as though this prison pleased him very well. "Then promise me you will stay here quietly until I come back. You may read while you're waiting." "I can't read," said Chell simply, sitting down with the book. After he had made his call, the doctor decided it might be as well to have a talk with the warden himself before questioning the boy any further. Here was more of a problem than appeared at first. It was a question not only of who wounded the goat, but of who wounded the boy's spirit, and what could be done to help him. When the doctor found the warden, he was in his stable kneeling on the straw beside Distelfink. He was muttering something to himself, and the doctor could see that he was very angry. "How is the goat?" he asked. "Has the veterinary come?" He came all right, and this thing is going to cost me money. Come here and look at this. Distelfink just lies there on the straw like you see her. The poor goat's in pain too, and while she's there she doesn't give any milk. She knew better than any of the other goats where to find the most delicious grass, and her milk was marvellous. Never very much of it. The others gave more than she, but her milk, oh, it was like honey from the flowers. And now look what the brute has done to her." "Do you mean Chell?" asked the doctor. "It is about Chell that I came to see you. I am convinced, Warden, that the boy didn't purposely harm your goat. He loves her, and he is hurt because she's in pain. One thing is certain. The goat fell somewhere, and Chell never stoned her."
"You think so?" cried the warden. "The whole valley knows the doings of that boy. He lies and steals and throws stones. There's not one household that doesn't stand in terror of him."
"He has behaved himself very well in my house," the doctor replied quietly.
"Why, that boy doesn't know how to behave himself," sneered the warden. "Probably learned a thing or two from his father, who was killed on one of his night prowls. Nobody knows where he hangs out, and just try and get him to work. One look at those baby-soft hands of his, and you can tell he'd never do a tap of work."
"Whatever else he may have done," said the doctor, "this time you are accusing the boy unjustly. I see no reason to keep him a prisoner in my house any longer, and so I intend to give him his liberty, and hope that he will return to school."
"Very well," the warden retorted. "I wash my hands of the whole affair."
He turned his back and walked into the house. When the doctor returned home, he found Chell poring over the book he had given him. "Chell, you are no longer a prisoner here," he announced. "I told the warden I believed you had not purposely harmed his goat." "Were they able to fix her leg so she won't limp?" asked Chell anxiously. "Yes, the veterinary came," replied the doctor, a little surprised to see Chell more concerned about the goat than he was about himself. "You may go whenever you wish, but come back as often as you like in the evening, and we will talk. Come to school, too," he added as an afterthought. Chell's face clouded with apprehension at this invitation. "Do I have to go to school?" "Eventually," said the doctor, "you will have to go to school, so you may as well begin. And another thing," he continued, "look for work, no matter what. In Meienfeld at the big farms you will surely find something to do. Everybody should work. And also eat regularly, where you are supposed to, and don't stay away nights and make people suspicious of you. No one knows where you go. If I talk to you like this, Chell, it is only because I want very much to see you on the right track, and then, whenever something happens, everyone won't say immediately, 'Chell did it.'" All the joy went out of the boy's face. He held out his hand to the doctor, raised his troubled eyes, and was gone. Throughout the village of Dorfli, admiration for Heidi grew stronger every day. Mothers and grandmothers opened their eyes in surprise when they saw the splendid work the children were doing in school. The boys returned, and regular classes began. One day, when she came into the classroom, Heidi saw a large pot of flowers standing outside on the window-sill. When she opened the casement, a delicate perfume arose from a clump of white alpine violets growing in a beautiful earthen pot. But who had put them there? She thought first of Chell. But where could Chell find such a lovely pot of flowers? And besides, if he was so anxious to please her, why hadn't he done as the doctor asked and come to school? Nothing had been seen of him for weeks. He had never returned to visit the doctor, and the poor man was nearly heartbroken, blaming himself for sending the boy away without finding out for certain with whom he lived and what he intended to do. From time to time, Heidi asked the children at school and villagers she met on the street if they knew what had become of Chell, but not one of them had seen him. He had not once come to the village for his meals, and nobody had any idea at all where he slept. She did learn one thing. When his father had died, 6 of the villagers had kindly offered him bed and board, and he had spent a little time with all 6, coming back occasionally for meals. But he'd not been back for a long time now. Nobody knew what had happened to him, and there were a great many who didn't seem to care. One evening, long after the grandfather had gone to bed, Heidi stood before her window looking out at the stars and seeing how the moonlight made a white halo over the peak of the Falkness. But tonight there was something fearful about the moonlight. It had none of the friendly warmth that the sun threw over the mountain peaks all day, nor the rosy glow it reflected on them in the early evening. It made ghosts of the glaciers and black shadows of the crags between. Heidi shivered and was about to pull in the shutters when suddenly she heard quick steps outside and then a sharp rap at the door. She hurried downstairs and asked who was there. "Let me in," a voice cried. "I have news for you, Heidi." Heidi threw open the door. "Peter, it's you! What do you want at this hour?" she asked. "I found out where Chell goes," Peter replied, "and I thought you'd like to come along and see." "You found out about Chell? Well, tell me, Peter. Don't stand there like a goat." "I can't tell you," Peter said, "but if you'll come with me, I'll show you where he goes." "Show me?" cried Heidi, growing frightened. "Do you want me to come now?" "Yes, you can come now if you'd rather. It's full moonlight and I can easily find the way." "No, Peter, I can't go out like this in the middle of the night," Heidi protested. "Only tell me, is he safe?" "He was never safer," replied Peter, smiling. "Then wait until morning and I will come with you. Sleep here, the grandfather has room, and tomorrow, when it is daylight, I will go wherever you take me, and you can show me whatever you want to show me. Now, good night, Peter." And she ran back upstairs to her own room, leaving Peter to sleep on the new bed her grandfather had carved out of white logs. The sun had barely risen when Peter opened the door and called, but Heidi was already up and dressed for the journey. "Come, let's go," she said. "I hope you remember where you promised to take me." "Yes, I remember very well," he said. "I was over the path only yesterday." They started off in gay spirits. Rosy clouds hung in the sky. Before long, the sun would be fully up. Pine trees along the road stood dark against the sunrise, and each tree had a different shape. Peter had chosen the path that led to the top of the pass. They climbed silently together up the mountain. The sun rose, and everything around them sparkled and glistened. The flowers along the path, the larch trees poised on the peaks, the ledges of rock over their heads. They had been climbing for over an hour when Peter left the road abruptly and turned left on the side of the steep slope covered by trees. They came to the edge of a wood which looked impenetrable. The huge old pine trees grew close together. Here and there fallen trunks and dead branches lay tangled on the ground. Still Peter pushed on. At last they came into a clearing, leaving the forest behind them. Never had Heidi seen anything more beautiful than the scene which lay before her eyes. She found herself in a sunny meadow full of flowers, red primroses, anemones tinted with rose, sweet-smelling violets, and gentians of a deep, deep blue. Tall peaks covered with snow towered before her into the blue sky. Between the ridges glistened immense glaciers, which looked as though they were slipping toward the valley like large rivers frozen in their course. The flowers glowed with colour and brilliance against their background of sparkling ice and snow. She ran to the edge of the meadow and, as she had expected, looked out upon the whole valley as far as Maienfeld. But how jagged the rocks were! They bristled like spears at the foot of the precipice. She was leaning over the edge to see how deep it was when she felt herself pulled by the skirt. "Heidi, take care! That is where Distelfink fell," cried Peter, still clutching her skirt. "Distelfink? But how did you know? Who told you about it?" "Chell," he replied simply. "Peter, you've made friends with him. I should have known it. He's so much like you." "You could have made friends with him too," Peter said, "if you hadn't been a teacher. But come, we're nearly there." "Nearly Where? Asked Heidi. Peter, where are you taking me? You wanted to see what happened to Chell, he replied. A sudden fear overtook her. Was it Chell's father who showed him this road? They say in the village that he was a smuggler. Was it over these rocks that he carried his smuggled goods down to the valley? Over there no one can go down, said Peter, pointing to the ledge. Chell's father never took him over this road. He found it by himself. Heidi, you must not believe what the people in the village say. Peter, why did you say I could have made friends with Chell if I hadn't been a teacher? Because he's afraid of you, Peter replied. He wanted to come to school when he found out how kind you were. He did come one day, but he saw that the boards were still across the little window, so he knew the dungeon was still there, and he was afraid because so often he doesn't know what is right and what is wrong until he finds himself being punished. I see. Heidi's reply was slow. Peter's words had set her thinking. I must do something about that window, she said. I shall see the warden about it tomorrow. As they walked together along the narrow ledge of rock, Heidi held fast to Peter with one hand, while with the other she caught hold of the dwarf trees that thrust out from the crevices. Finally they reached a mass of rock which jutted out like a roof, and underneath it was a platform where, at last, they could walk more securely. Heidi looked down at the abyss beneath her, shivered, and then, turning her head, found she was standing before a deep cave. Peter? What's this? You can't come in here! A voice cried at her wildly. It's mine, I tell you! It's mine! I won't let you in! It was Chell, and he was stooping over to pick up a rock when Peter seized him firmly by the arm. Wait a minute, boy, he said quietly. Is that any way to welcome a guest? I intended to show your teacher where I found you, but now that you are here, you can show her yourself. The boy's eyes were as savage as a little animal's. I'll show her, he cried. I'll not have my things taken away. She won't take your things away, Chell, cried Peter. She's a teacher. Yes, Peter replied, but to me she's the same little girl who used to come up to the pastures, and if I know her, she'll be as pleased as I was when you show her your secret. But I found this place, the boy whimpered. It's mine, where nobody can follow me. Why should you be afraid of being followed? Asked Heidi. Up here you can have nothing to hide. Peter laughed at this, and the boy looked at him. Show her what you have to hide, Chell. That's what I brought her here to see. Chell looked up at Heidi, but she was smiling at him kindly. You won't take everything away from me like the schoolmaster did, and not let me go on? He asked, half yielding. I would never take away anything that belonged to you, Chell. Peter will tell you I wouldn't do that. Will you let us in, then? Asked Peter. The boy hesitated, looked up at their faces, then stepped aside quietly and let them pass. Sunlight penetrated for a little distance into the cave, but beyond all was black. In the entrance stood a roughly made table and bench. 4 stakes firmly planted into an uneven board formed the table, and the bench had been made the same way. The table, the bench, and the ground around them were covered with broken pieces of pottery of all imaginable colours. Heidi had to bend down her head to go in. At Peter's invitation, she sat down on the little bench and looked around. Before her were several pieces of paper covered with paintings, and now she understood why the place was littered with broken crockery. The pieces had been used to mix colours on, strange colours that Heidi had never seen before. She examined one of the drawings. Who made this? She asked. I did, replied Chell, as though confessing a fault. But it's lovely, she exclaimed, fascinated by what she saw on the paper. It was a painting of white roses and lilies over a tomb. Ivy of a surprising yellow-green wound around the flowers and the stone. Heidi studied it a moment, wondering where she had seen it before. And then she recognized it as being a copy of the picture that hung on the wall in the doctor's house in Dorfley. The drawing was beautiful, and the copy exact, in spite of the strange colours. Did you paint all this, Chell? These roses, these lilies, this ivy too? She asked in amazement. Chell nodded, his eyes to the ground. You aren't going to take everything away from me and not let me paint any more? He asked anxiously. Peter said you wouldn't. You're not annoyed with me?" "Annoyed with you? Why, I'm delighted. How pleased the doctor will be when he hears of this wonderful talent." "But I thought it was wrong," Chell faltered. "The schoolmaster said it was wrong to draw. He took my drawing away from me and put me in the dungeon."
"You see?" put in Peter.
"I see," Heidi replied. "The poor, stupid schoolmaster, not to recognize such talent. But in my school there is a new art class, and, if you will come, I shall give you good colours, and you will see how different your flowers will be. But tell me first, Chell, do you stay in this cave all the time? Do you stay here at night?" Suddenly a change came over the boy's face. He threw back his head, and the hunted expression disappeared from his eyes. "You are not angry," he cried, "and you will give me good colours, and my flowers will be beautiful. Oh, I want to tell you everything, everything I know. But where shall I begin?"
"Tell her what you did and where you went when you were away for days at a time and no one knew anything about you," prompted Peter.
"I went off," he said, raising truthful eyes towards her. "My father was no longer there, and I never remember about my mother. I went with the other boys, and we often quarrelled and threw stones at each other. Whenever I hit one of them, he would cry right away, 'I'll tell my father on you.' Then his father would come and beat me. But when they hit me with stones, I had no father to run to, so in the end I went farther and farther away so that no one would find me. The farther away I went, the more beautiful the flowers were. I wanted to pick them all. I picked big bunches, but in the evening they withered and all the colours faded away. I thought, if only I could copy them, then I could keep them for always. So I drew the flowers with pencils I took from school. I took paper too, but the schoolmaster didn't keep colours, so I tried very hard to make them. Without colour, the flowers weren't the same." Heidi was listening to every word with rapt attention. "Then you make the colours I see here on the paper? Why, that's marvellous! How do you do it?" "First I had an idea of squeezing flowers," he said. "Nothing came out of the petals. They were only spoiled and broken. So then I tried pressing blueberries, and that gave me a beautiful purple to paint with. Then I found little red berries in the forest, which made a deep, lovely colour, and I found a flower at last from which I could make a yellow juice, and leaves from which I could make green."
"Chell," interrupted Peter, seeing that he was absorbed by the question of painting, "hadn't you better tell us why you didn't go to the villagers' houses for your meals, as you were supposed to after your father died?"
"I went to several houses," said the boy, "but everywhere they scolded me. Then, when I was picking flowers in the meadow, I sometimes met a goat, and she gave me milk. The one I liked best was Distelfink. She knew me so well, and would run to meet me as soon as she saw me. She followed me everywhere. One day I said to her, 'Distelfink, I will find you the best grasses that grow on the mountain, as much as I can pick, and in exchange you will give me milk.'"
"But that was not right, Chell," Peter said. "Since the goat belongs to the warden, her milk belongs to him too. You can't make a bargain like that with someone else's goat."
Chell was surprised at this. "But I gave her so many nice things to eat," he protested. "None of the other goats were as well fed. One day I came near here, breaking my way through the underbrush. I was looking for a hiding place for my papers and colours, some place where no one could find them and take them away. I came out of the woods there where the beautiful flowers grow, and as I ran from one to another, Distelfink came jumping along at my side. She'd followed me right through the forest and among all that underbrush. I told her to wait while I looked at the flowers, then we would go and pick up some of the little plants that grow up here and that she likes so well. I'd finished looking at the flowers and had a nice bunch for her, but she'd disappeared. I called and called, and then I heard her answer with little bleats the way she always does when I call her. But I couldn't see her anywhere. I looked down on the rocks, but she wasn't there. At last I discovered that the bleating came from under that big ledge of rock. I climbed down on my hands and knees and found the entrance to this cave. Distelfink bleated as much as to say, 'See, I've found a beautiful room for you. You can hide your things here and no one will ever find them.' That was what I wanted. I was perfectly safe and peaceful, and I could work by myself. I built this table and bench, and Distelfink came again and again to see me. Once,
Instead of going around, she tried to come down straight above the cave. Well, she slipped and fell, and that was the time she broke her leg. You see, I didn't stone her. The warden lied. But I did stone him. And that was very wrong, said Heidi. You must never stone anybody again, Chell. Promise me that you never will. Will you put me in the dungeon if I do? I don't put children in the dungeon, Heidi said. But the dungeon is still there, Chell protested. I know. I saw it when I came with the flowers. Ah, Chell, cried Heidi, you've given yourself away. Now I know who brought me those beautiful flowers. They make me happy every day. And now that I know it was you who gave them to me, they will make me doubly happy. You thought of me then, even though you never came back. Why didn't you come back? Was it only because you were afraid of the dungeon? I will never go to a school with a dungeon in it, he announced. Never, never as long as I live. You must have been in the dungeon quite a few times, said Peter. What was it like? And why did the schoolmaster put you there? He put me there every time he caught me drawing pictures, Chell said. Oh, poor Chell, said Heidi, putting her hand affectionately on his shoulder. I shall not try to make you go to school. But this savage life in the woods and these secret errands of yours are at an end now. You're coming home with me. My grandfather is old, and I am away at school all day, and he's very lonely. He will like to have you with him to keep him company. Don't you think it would be better, Peter asked, if he came to the village with me? The doctor took a great fancy to him, and when he hears about his talent for drawing, I'm sure he will want to educate him as he did you. Chell was looking from one face to the other, wondering if he might not soon wake up and find all this was only a dream. Before, nobody had wanted him. He had been an outcast, stoned, imprisoned, hunted, living a savage existence and fearing everybody. Now 2 homes were open to him. Such good fortune seemed almost unbelievable. But if I go to live with the doctor, can I come back to my cave sometimes? He finally asked. We'll come here again together many times, Heidi told him. I'll show you how to use the paints I have at school, and you can make copies of all the flowers that grow in the beautiful meadow just above your cave. But now, let's go. Will you show us the way home again? Shall I take all my things? Asked Chell, eyeing his treasured dabs of colour and homemade brushes. Take your paintings and show them to the doctor, but leave the rest. Then they will be here in your fortress when you return. Chell spent the next night in the room at the doctor's, where he had first tried to copy the white flowers. When the doctor came in next morning, he was busy copying the same painting on the back of an old piece of wrapping paper. The doctor gave him a fresh white sheet and 2 well-sharpened pencils. Then, taking the painting from the wall, he placed it conveniently in front of him on the table. There, now you can work all day long, he said. Chell stared silently at his new working tools, remembered and said, Thank you. After school, Heidi stopped in to see the warden. He was just coming from the stable when she reached his house. How is Distelfink doing? She asked at once. For several days now she seemed as spry as ever, even with her leg in splints, he replied. But there is one thing I noticed since she broke her leg, and I cannot understand it. She gives much more milk than before, but it's not the same. It lacks the fine, delicate flavour. Heidi did not think it was quite the moment to solve this puzzle for the warden, although it was perfectly clear to her. She had other things to speak to him about. The doctor has taken Chell to live with him, and may want to adopt him, she began, and I have come to ask you to make a change in the schoolhouse, so that he won't be afraid to return to school. It will be very simple. I only want the boards taken off that window in the cloakroom, and glass put there in its place. Do you think I went to the trouble of fixing a darkroom in the school only to tear it out again? Said the warden. And all for what? That the worst boy, a tramp known for miles around, won't be afraid to go to school? A good-for-nothing who hasn't anything better to do than abuse animals? He was so excited that his hands were shaking as he talked. Such hatred, such prejudice seemed unbelievable to Heidi. About Chell, I will say nothing, she retorted. You have such decided notions that I could never change them with words. Chell will show you what he is,
and that will have more effect. As for my request, there is nothing extraordinary about it. The dungeon is there, and there is not a mother in Dorfley who would not like to see it made into a cloakroom again. If you refuse to do it, then you can hunt for somebody else to teach your school. I refuse to be responsible for frightening little children." A little girl had been listening to the conversation between the teacher and the warden, and she ran as fast as she could to the house next door. "Germaine! Germaine! Hurry up! Come quickly!" she cried to her friend, who was busy helping her mother in the kitchen. Germaine came running out, drying her hands. "The teacher is going to leave! What shall we do?" panted the little girl in her excitement. "What does she want to leave for?" asked Germaine. "Because the warden boarded up the cloakroom window," and she ran on to the next house. Germaine, too, ran off with the news of the terrible tragedy. By evening, the whole village knew that Heidi wished to leave, but no one knew why. Because the warden boarded up the window was all they could make out. When the day's work was done, everyone, being more or less affected by the news, came out and took the road to the warden's house. When he saw all the people coming up the hill, he came out too, thinking that Chell was up to some new prank and that the village was up in arms again. But what he heard was very different. The women attacked him angrily and demanded to know why he was sending Heidi away. If Heidi wanted anything extraordinary, she most probably had her reasons for it. They, the mothers, felt they knew better than anyone else her value in the town, and they would never consent to allowing such a good teacher to leave. In turn, the men arrived, one after another, to see what was happening. They felt the same. Why allow anyone so good and so devoted to leave? Since Heidi had begun teaching the school, everything in the village had changed for the better. The school was hardly recognizable, so neat and tidy had it been kept. The children were clean and orderly, and rarely quarrelled. No, they would certainly not agree to let the teacher leave. What was this window that had been boarded up, anyway? When at last the warden was allowed to speak, he explained that the thing in itself wasn't difficult. It was a simple question of putting in a window and making a cloakroom out of the schoolhouse cell. But what was absolutely out of the question was the stand the teacher had taken for that rogue Chell, whom she'd persuaded the doctor to adopt and take to live with him. On all sides were exclamations of surprise. The villagers thought Heidi must have made some unreasonable demand. This was not only reasonable, but right and just. And, as for Chell, the fact that Heidi had taken him in hand proved she was no weakling. There and then, everyone offered to help with the alterations on the school. The warden was completely taken aback. "She's all right, I must admit, but that good-for-nothing, bah! You'll see, you'll see," he grumbled, going back into his house. Several weeks later, when the children came to class as usual, they saw a well-dressed boy sitting before a little table by the window drawing. He was copying a picture in beautiful colours, and his head was bent low over his work. "He must be an artist to be able to copy that picture," whispered one of the girls as she slipped into her place. The boy was so intent upon his work that he didn't turn his head to right or left, and the class couldn't see his face. But suddenly, sharp-eyed Germaine leaned towards her neighbour's ear and whispered, "It's Chell! Look! I'll bet you anything it's Chell!" "It's not Chell," retorted another little girl. "The warden said just today that we'd see what good-for-nothingness he'd been up to all this time he hasn't come to school." "It is Chell," declared Germaine obstinately. After class, she stopped on her way out and looked around from the back, just as the boy lifted his head. He wore shining new shoes, a white shirt, and a suit that was as clean and new as any of the Sunday best in the village. It was Chell. She recognized him at once. But his whole expression was changed. Germaine took one more good look, and then ran out to announce the miracle to her friends in the schoolyard. No one lingered on the road that day. All the children in the school ran home as fast as they could with the news. For 4 weeks, Chell, burning with enthusiasm, had worked without interruption under Dr. Reboux's excellent direction. He made such progress that even Heidi and Peter, who had all confidence in him, were surprised. During this time, Heidi had often gone back to Chell's cave, where, with her splendid bright colours, she helped him copy the lovely flowers that grew in what she and Peter had decided to call the Enchanted Garden. As they worked there together, Chell's eyes glowed with happiness, because he could draw and paint now as much as he liked, without having to hide away from everybody, and without the problem of manufacturing his own brushes and colours. When Heidi praised his work and told him that if he continued like that, he would surely be a great artist, Chell's heart was filled with joy. After studying a painting of some wild flowers which Chell had made, Heidi remarked, "Your work delights me, but why did you make these anemones a different pink from those in the picture you were copying?" "I know those flowers so well," said Chell. "They're just the colour I made them. It is exactly the same colour and not the colour in this picture. I've often looked at them growing near this cave." Heidi smiled. "Then you were right to paint them this way. You see, it will help your work a lot, knowing the flowers the way you do. I must remember to tell this to the doctor." Chell's face fairly shone with joy. The transformation of Chell gave the villagers something to talk about for a long while to come. Furthermore, they gave Heidi credit for everything good and desirable that happened for miles around. There was not a person in Dorfley who didn't feel that the worst thing that could happen to the community would be for Heidi to leave. Even the warden was convinced of it. For Chell, the happiest moment of the day was in the evening. Then the doctor sat close to him, and while he painted and drew, read stories to him. Usually they were stories of poor boys like himself, who had become great and famous. He told him of the many schools in Lausanne and in Paris, where professors held classes in drawing and painting. On Sundays, Chell put his books and lessons aside, and often, after church, he and the doctor went together to the meadow up on the mountain, where hardy flowers bloomed. Heidi and Peter were the only ones in the village who knew where they went. As they passed, the villagers remarked, "It's beyond me to understand how such a little tramp could change so quickly into the neatest and nicest boy in the village." Only one other living creature knew of this lovely garden high up on the mountain, and she came often, limping slightly, to stand affectionately close to Chell. It was Distelfink. Chell had not forgotten where to find the delicious grasses and plants she enjoyed so well. He loved this old goat as a dear friend. Toward the end of the winter, the doctor sent the following letter to a professor he knew in Frankfurt. "Dear Professor, some time ago you asked me if I knew of anyone who was familiar with the rare flowers which bloom in the Alps, and who was a fine enough artist to make the illustrations for your textbooks on botany. If you're still looking for someone to do this work, I can recommend my adopted son, Chell, who has all the qualifications. He not only has a profound knowledge of flowers, but a real artistic talent as well. I shall look forward with pleasure to hearing from you. In the meantime, I remain, yours sincerely, Dr. Rebu." Only a few days later, the reply came. So, in the early spring, as soon as the first flowers appeared, the doctor sent Chell to select the most perfect specimens of each variety. These he placed in a glass and told him to draw them as well as he possibly could. Sometimes Heidi and Peter accompanied Chell when he went up to the meadow to choose the flowers he was going to draw. Chell could not decide which were the happiest moments for him. Those when he was at work with the doctor leaning over him, directing and helping, or those high up in the meadow, which was no longer a refuge, but a beautiful garden that he knew and loved so well. He often felt like throwing himself on the ground and gathering all the flowers into his arms. One evening, when Chell came in from a trip to the meadow, the doctor handed him a package. "Chell, you no longer need me to help you on your way," he said. "All this belongs to you. It is in payment for your beautiful work. No one in the village thought you were capable of working and earning a living. Now they will see what you can do. The professor who sends you this money is so pleased with your work that he wants you to continue copying flowers for his books. After this first edition, there will be others for which you will make the illustrations, and each new edition will pay you as this one has. You will see, Chell, the more perfect you become,
the more work you will have.
"This belongs to you and the teacher," said Chell, pointing to the money. "You taught me everything I know."
No, it was your work. Neither of us would want your money. Put it aside for the moment unless you want something. Is there anything you'd like to do with it?
"Yes, there is something," said Chell.
How much will you need?
Chell thought for a moment and then announced, "I will need 6 of those banknotes." The doctor was surprised and looked at the boy, but he had confidence in him and decided to allow him to spend his money as he pleased. Chell took it and went out. Not far off, he came to a small house on the edge of the village. He went directly into the main room, which was empty, put 1 banknote on the table, and cried to the woman in the kitchen, "Paid!" Running from one to the other, he entered 6 houses, in each of which he had taken his meals and slept overnight. In each one he left a banknote and said the same thing, "Paid!" For he had never forgotten the day that they told him he was an expense to the village, good-for-nothing that he was, who couldn't appreciate a good bed. All Dorfley was in an uproar when they learned that Chell not only earned money, but that his first thought had been to pay back what no one else would have even considered a debt. Chell, the good-for-nothing, had at last won the respect of the village. It was true that a very little time before he had been a tramp, and it was Heidi who had brought about this miracle. Now, at no price, would they ever consider allowing her to leave the school. And then, one fine morning, quite unexpectedly, Peter asked Heidi to marry him. She was so happy that for a moment she could say nothing. Then she said simply, "Yes, Peter," and that was that. They planned a street wedding so that everyone in the village could take part in the beautiful ceremony. When they told the grandfather about it, his old eyes sparkled. "Peter will always look after me just as you have," Heidi told him, "and we'll both look after you and give you the best of care. We'll look after the goats too, and we'll live here in this house where we can always look up to the mountains. Grandfather, we're going to be so happy, you and Peter and I." Dorfley was noted for its quaint customs. On the day of the wedding, men and women were garbed in their holiday best. Bright shawls were to be seen everywhere. They were embroidered in every shade of pink, gold, yellow, and blue. Brigitte wore a deep purple shawl over a stiffly starched blouse with wide puffed sleeves. The doctor came along beside her in his shiny black suit with a stiff collar standing about his ears. Chell's hat was tall and red, and he wore an eagle's feather. Music heralded the wedding party. The musicians played on flutes, pipes, and old-time stringed lutes. An accordion player in a red waistcoat headed the band, and the others followed. Next came the bride, her cheeks glowing with happiness. Heidi was wearing a bridal gown of purest silk. Her veil was a creation of flowers from her own enchanted garden, wound about with white ribbon. Peter walked beside her, tall and proud. The grandfather was not far behind, marching along as jauntily as the others, resplendent in his green suit. Then came all the school children of Dorfley, with Jamie to keep them in order, singing a beautiful old folk song. Clara was at the wedding too, a Clara Heidi would hardly have known for the stately lady she'd become. Jamie had sent for the little sister she had so often spoken of when she and Heidi were at school together. The sister joined the wedding procession, carrying the wheat. How picturesque it all was! How gay the music sounded! The solemn rites in the church had not taken away one bit of the gaiety or the laughter. It was a day never to be forgotten. How glad Heidi was that she had been faithful to her own people, that she had come back to Dorfley, where she belonged, back to Dorfley and to Peter. Suddenly she remembered a quaint custom of the villagers, and she bent to take off her shoe. Everywhere children were throwing flowers. Now Heidi seized her wedding slipper and, aiming it very carefully, threw it into the crowd. It landed just at Chell's feet, and all about him were heard cries of, "Good luck, Chell! Good luck with your painting!" "Thank you, Heidi," he called out happily. "Thank you for throwing me the lucky slipper." The wedding procession passed on down the street to the little village square where tables were arranged for the wedding feast. The music played gaily on, and everybody laughed and chattered and ate. There was dancing and singing far into the night. But Heidi and Peter slipped away from the crowd early. On their wedding day, of all days, they must not miss seeing the sun set fire to the snow on the mountain tops. And as they watched, the grandfather watched with them, and when the splendour had faded, he said, "You see, Heidi, it fades only to return again tomorrow." "It's a promise," said Peter, "but however many times it may return, it will never see a happier day than this."